vi ringrazio e vi do il benvenuto a questo evento. Cominciamo l'introduzione istituzionale in italiano e poi proseguiremo in inglese il resto della sessione tecnica. Quindi è un grande piacere, ringrazio il direttore Andrea Zanchi per i suoi saluti.
Bene, buongiorno a tutti, scusate ho la voce un po' bassa perché sono reduce da un'influenza e ho preso un po' freddo sul terreno negli ultimi giorni. Vedo che resiste, spero di riuscire a parlare. Allora, per prima cosa, benvenuti a Bicocca, benvenuti a questa attività organizzata dal nostro Dipartimento. Io sono direttore del Dipartimento di Scienze dell'Ambiente e della Terra, è uno dei dipartimenti più importanti, più grossi dell'intera Ateneo di Bicocca. Oramai siamo in quasi più di 100 persone, ci sono circa 80 docenti e 25 e 30 tecnici. E come dice il nome è un dipartimento che si occupa di problematiche legate all'ambiente, no? È nato una trentina di anni fa quando non si parlava ancora di Antropocene, ma io credo che oggi come oggi potrebbe essere facilmente ribattezzato con questo nome perché più della metà dei costituenti del nostro dipartimento si occupa proprio di questa tematica, delle interazioni tra l'uomo, gli effetti sull'ambiente, ancora prima diciamo che venissero definite in modo più chiaro come è stato fatto negli ultimi 20 anni. Questa scuola è la terza scuola a carattere perlomeno nazionale, anche internazionale, che è stata organizzata quest'anno e ricade nell'ambito dei risultati che abbiamo avuto col cosiddetto progetto di eccellenza. Nel 2017 il nostro Dipartimento ha ottenuto una valutazione molto positiva nell'ambito della ricerca, della cosiddetta VQR, valutazione della qualità della ricerca, e ha avuto la possibilità di accedere a questo ulteriore concorso per il denominato dipartimenti di eccellenza. Nel 2018 all'inizio è risultato vincitore e abbiamo ottenuto una grossa quantità di fondi molto importante, sono 8 milioni di euro, che ci hanno permesso di svolgere un sacco di attività e tra queste attività era compreso uno sviluppo, un ampliamento di tutte le attività che riguardavano il dottorato, la cosiddetta alta formazione, con la possibilità di aprire nuove borse di studio e di sviluppare anche delle attività didattiche molto particolari, tra cui appunto c'era l'impegno di tenere queste scuole a carattere molto ampio. Queste tre scuole sono state tenute tutte durante il 2021, chiaramente è evidente per problemi Covid. Una prima è stata organizzata dal professor Marco Malusà, che è il coordinatore del nostro dottorato, in chimica, geologia e scienze ambientali del DISAT. La seconda è stata tenuta poco tempo fa, la prima scusate era molto geologica sui processi di subduzione, la seconda è stata invece sulla green chemistry, è stata organizzata soprattutto dal professor Langhe, che è chimico, e la terza invece è stata organizzata da Andrea Franzetti ed è stata dedicata al curriculum direttamente di tipo ambientale, no? Quindi questo è importante da ricordare perché è il risultato di un lungo lavoro di ricerca che ha svolto il nostro Dipartimento nel corso del tempo. E appunto io sono veramente molto contento di potervi vedere direttamente, no? Oramai risulta quasi una novità ritrovarsi davanti agli studenti in diretta, avere tutti i colleghi presenti per poter riprendere a fare le discussioni che eravamo abituati a fare un paio di anni fa. Allora, io sono geologo, mi occupo però più di problematiche di tipo strutturale, ma volevo richiamare alcuni concetti generali sull'Antropocene, perché ci tengo a sottolineare che questa idea dell'Antropocene ha delle origini non recentissime ma geologiche. Allora ho scoperto che il primo che ha parlato di Antropocene, che ha sentito la necessità di definire un'era, era un paleontologo, un geologo, si chiama Stoppani, forse qualcuno di voi l'ha sentito nominare, e nel 1873 ha scritto un testo molto famoso di stratigrafia, geologia stratigrafica, in cui appunto chiede sente la necessità di definire un'era antropozoica, no? Addirittura in cui si vede, si sente, si tocca con mano proprio l'attività fatta dall'uomo. Questo 1873, sono 150 anni fa. Tutti voi sapete che poi l'Antropocene non è ancora ben definito, non è ancora stato definito bene dal punto di vista geologico. Credo che la professoressa Malinverno oggi vi parlerà di tutte le problematiche di nomenclatura, perché la definizione di un'era geologica, di un nuovo periodo, richiede proprio il riconoscimento di proxy che devono essere visti, diciamo, ritrovati nello stesso punto delle successioni stratigrafiche in tutto il mondo. Quindi è qualcosa di molto complesso, soprattutto è qualcosa di cui noi non siamo abituati perché ci siamo dentro, lo stiamo vivendo, no? Noi siamo abituati come geologi a studiare il passato, a cercare di stabilire i confini tra le ere, ma quando viviamo all'interno di un periodo è chiaramente difficilissimo trovare dei marker proprio di tipo geologico, ma di fatto noi, la cosa importante che credo che sia il motivo dominante di questo incontro è quello di studiare, di cercare di capire che cosa sta succedendo, no? E questo tipo di senso, diciamo, dello studio delle scienze della Terra dedicato alle interazioni con l'ambiente è recentissimo, perché sono solo pochi anni che noi siamo consci del fatto che l'uomo ha provocato i cambiamenti climatici, no? Credo che siano al massimo 50 anni che noi ci siamo resi conto di questo, ma è stato riconosciuto da te in tempi molto più stretti. E appunto le discussioni di oggi sono viste da molti punti di vista trasversali. Questo è un altro aspetto molto importante, perché il problema sicuramente coinvolge moltissime discipline, non solo la geologia, anzi coinvolge tutta una serie di aspetti che oggi e domani discuterete insieme, che possono arricchire il quadro e aiutarci soprattutto a mitigare gli effetti di questo che l'Antropocene, diciamo, sta vivendo attualmente. Ecco, io vi ricordo, chiudo con una nota un po' catastrofista, vi ricordo che le definizioni dei tempi geologici di solito sono basate sulle grandi estinzioni, no? C'è la Permiano, Triassico, periodi passati, no? Tra 250 milioni di anni fa, ecco, la più grande crisi biologica che ha definito il limite tra queste due ere. Ecco, auguriamoci che tutto il lavoro che stiamo facendo riesca ad evitare che l'Antropocene sia definito da una crisi biologica ancora più grossa di quella che si sono verificate tra Permiano, Triassico, da Cretacico e Paleocene. Vi ringrazio e vi auguro 2 giornate piene di spunti interessanti.
Grazie mille direttore. Adesso invito sul palco Maria Lucia Frezzotti, che è il coordinatore della scuola di dottorato del nostro Ateneo, per i saluti. Grazie mille.
Grazie. Buongiorno a tutti. Benvenuti, è veramente un piacere, grazie per avermi coinvolto stamattina nell'apertura dei lavori di questa scuola estremamente interessante di Anthropocene, a new epoch for the earth, a new challenge for humanity. La nostra scuola di dottorato chiaramente supporta e plaude alle attività di formazione, soprattutto alle attività di formazione su temi pregnanti come questi. In questo momento l'ha già detto il direttore Zanchi in maniera chiara e cristallina, il nostro pianeta chiama all'azione con problematiche che devono essere affrontate subito e chiaramente con un approccio che deve essere transdisciplinare, multidisciplinare. Questo è poi alla fine il messaggio che forse è dietro alla definizione di epoca antropocene, quello di cominciare a fare scienza uscendo dai singoli ambiti disciplinari. E questo direi che è proprio una caratteristica della nostra scuola, ed entrando nel dettaglio riguardo a questi temi che, come ha ricordato il professor Zanchi, non riguardano solo l'ambito delle scienze, ma in particolare il corso di dottorato in scienze geologiche, scienze chimiche, geologiche e ambientali, coordinato da Marco, dal professor Marusà, e diciamo coadiuvato dal professor Franzetti per quello che riguarda le tematiche ambientali, è sicuramente un ambito dove si vedono crescere figure di dottori di ricerca che hanno veramente una formazione allargata, una formazione diciamo assolutamente in linea con l'antropocene, con i temi che l'antropocene chiama. Quindi ciò detto, io vi auguro veramente una bella scuola, una scuola di scambi, una scuola di discussioni, di conoscenza e anche di crescita per voi studenti e studentesse che poi in realtà siete i nostri ricercatori più brillanti. Vi ringrazio, buon lavoro.
Grazie mille, professoressa Frezzotti. So I think that we can switch to English and start the technical part of the workshop. So we have today 4 lectures in the morning. And welcome back in a real room, and also welcome to the people that are connected on YouTube. So I think that we can start, and I'm very happy to have Donato Giovannelli here. Donato is a full professor of microbiology at the University Federico II in Naples, and his talk is on a really fascinating topic, and the title is The History of the Earth, Geosphere, Biosphere, Coevolution Through Time. So thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Does it work? Yeah? No? Microphone? Just a second, huh? Okay, now it works. Can you hear me better? Good morning, first. It's nice to see people alive. Can I ask you to switch off the light on the stage, please? Se può spegnere le luci sul palco, così la presentazione... Non so se mi hanno sentito. Scusate, posso chiedere di spegnere le luci sul palco? Grazie. Okay, thank you Andrea for organizing the school and inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm a microbiologist, so I work mainly looking at microbial diversity in extreme environments. That's very loud. Maybe it's better. That's what I do most of the time, and my focus is on looking at the impact of life on planetary scale. So this morning, since I'm the first, I have the honor to be the first, and I'm going to try to start from the basics, giving you a perspective on deep time, on what does it mean Anthropocene, if you look at it, looking at the changes that the planet went through throughout its history. I'm sure many of you have seen this before. How many? Let's see. How many of you recognize this? Okay, maybe 50%. This is the kneeling curve. This is the way we started to figure out that CO2 was increasing over time. Those are measurements taken daily since 1958 in Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And the person responsible for this, Charles David Kneeling, at the time, they told him, oh, that's the volcano giving you CO2 signal, those are ships around. So he started measuring the same atmospheric concentration also in the Arctic and in Antarctica and in different places of the planet, just to show that the measurements were accurate. And actually CO2 was increasing everywhere. And this is a tweet from the other day when I was preparing the presentation. There are daily tweets that give you CO2 concentration. You can see we are at 414 ppm in the atmosphere in Mauna Loa. I found this very interesting because you can go in, you can go to the website, I don't know if you've ever been there, you can explore the trend. This is the last year, trend of the last year, we can see a seasonality in the CO2 concentration. You can look at 2 consecutive years, and you can already start to see that the maximum level are actually increasing, or you can look at the entire series, as I was showing you, from 58 going up. And you can actually plot your own life in CO2. I don't know if you've ever seen it or done it. I did it a few years ago. I'm still updating it. So I was born at 341 ppm. My degree was at 384 ppm. I got my PhD at 400 ppm. I started to work in Italian university at 409, and I got promoted at 413. Now I consider myself to be relatively young, and this is a 20% increase in my lifetime. That's staggering. It's incredible. It's shocking. Just looking at the amount of CO2 that we've been accumulating in the atmosphere in our own lifetime is shocking. And you can go on. You can look for all the record. This is the last 300 years. This is the measurements done in Mauna Loa. This is ice core data from the Industrial Revolution onward. And you can go further back. This is the last 800,000 years. You can see there have been many variations. Some of them are connected with the proxy we're using. Some of them were variation through time. But you can see something. So many people say, yeah, but CO2 has been changing over time a lot. Yes, sure. We are up there right now. So it's striking and clear that as and this correlates with increase in temperature and the projection we all know about. The last IPCC projection came out in August. The COP is ongoing or just finished. It was ongoing last week. So we can see how this project in what is going to happen. At least to temperature. We're not sure what is going to happen to many other systems, but at least to temperature because of this. So it becomes clear that human activities are actually impacting the planet on a scale and in ways that is difficult to predict. So as the director was saying before, the Anthropocene, we still have not defined its boundaries. We're still discussing what actually entails for the planet, what will be the consequences. And I think we need to stop thinking in consequences for human species and for the environment, because we are part of the environment, so there's a lot to be said there. But what I'm going to try to do today with you is thinking about what we can learn from the past, what we can learn from other events that have changed our planet because of biology. We are changing the surface of our planet, but this is not the first time that happened. It has happened before and in many, many ways. Before we dive deep in a couple of examples, I want to share with you a few concepts that helped me when I was a student and then starting to work on these type of topics to think about what biology can do on a geological scale. Usually when we think about heredity, we tend to think about this. We think about genetic heredity, the genes you inherit from your ancestors. So all the adaptation to the environment you inherit. Reality is that we don't just inherit genes, we inherit a lot more than that. So a couple concepts that really helped me throughout, and I think they will help you to better get a feeling for how the planet has changed and what Anthropocene may entail. First one is niche construction. So basically, this is the ability of some species to change the environment around them in a way that is permanent and is transferred to their offspring. Now, it's easy to visualize, not just for what we do into the planet. Think about termite mounds. This is a great example of niche construction. The impact these mounds are having on the geochemistry of the soil, on the landscape, on the movement of other animals, on the interaction with other animals, on the cooling in the soil is staggering. It goes far beyond what they do as a species. On the other side, the other concept is actually ecological inheritance. So basically, the set of environmental change, part of your extended phenotypes that you get from previous species and previous life. It's incredible if you think that as a species, we do not just inherit the ability to use oxygen, or like most eukaryotes, or all eukaryotes actually, sorry, but we also inherit oxygen. So we inherited a planet that contains 21% oxygen in the atmosphere. At the same time, we inherited the gene to use the oxygen. That's part of the genetic inheritance and the ecological inheritance we get from our past. An example like this can be in many ways. So if you think about what we do as a human species, we do not just give to our offspring the ability or the knowledge to use something, we give them also a heavily modified environment in which they live and they adapt. So it's like if you think about life and an environment, and you think about how life is adapted to its environment, you can think about coevolution as the way in which the environment shapes life and life shapes the environment through both ecological inheritance and genetic inheritance over time, so that one shapes the other in a way that is difficult sometimes to understand directionality of the two. But that's exactly what happens. Imagine that life is perfectly adapted to the fold of its environment, so it has a very good fitness for that environment, but its action, they're gonna change the landscape, and it's gonna adapt again and again and again and again, and throughout time, we have coevolution. The real question becomes, so if biology has the ability to influence the environment in ways that are then inherited throughout time in deep time, we talked about oxygen, that was 2.4 or 2.3 billion years ago, the real question becomes exactly how much biology can change its environment. And if you think about the Anthropocene, you should not think that this is the first time that biology has had a huge impact on the planet. We have plenty of other examples. And today I'm going to spend some time speaking about one of the biggest examples that you all know about, but I'm going to give you some insight on things that maybe you don't know were cascading effects. But what we fail to do as a community, at least microbiological community, is look for many other ways in which life and the environment have co-evolved. So how much has biology influenced the planetary evolution through times? And again, before giving the example, I really think, especially because this is a very diverse audience, I understand you are a PhD school in environmental science, so there's people coming from all different disciplines. There's a few things you should know about microbiology, because I tend to think in deep time about microbes first for a number of reasons. First one, microbes have dominated and dominate still today the bio and biogeochemistry. So if you look at an image like this, which is essentially a recap of the geological history of our planet from its onset around 4.6 billion years ago to modern days, so a full turn of the clock, you see that life probably started on our planet around 3.8 to 4 billion years ago, and that was prokaryotic, it was microbial. And you can see that for a very, very long time, it was only microbes, only prokaryotes, then eukaryotes came online, but it was not until 1.5 billion years ago that we got onset of multicellular life. And if you look up here, you have animals and land plants, mammals, and then humans are a dot up here, hominids, that you can barely see. So if you look at the history of our planet, for 1, 2, 3 billion years, this planet has been dominated by unicellular life form. So if you think about the evolution of the planet, if you think about the biogeochemistry of the planet throughout the time, you cannot ignore the fact that this planet is a microbial planet. And this is true in the past, but it's also true at the present. Microbial life produces about 45% of the oxygen. The oxygen we're breathing here is not produced by the plant outside. It's probably being produced by marine phytoplankton in the ocean maybe 10,000 years ago or close to that. Sorry, that was 45%, that's a typo. 45% of primary productivity. Microbes are responsible for remineralizing up to 90% of organic carbon. They're responsible for nearly all biological nitrogen fixation. They're responsible for a lot of methane emission, and we know that methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and a lot more. So if you think about biogeochemistry, you need to think microbial. There's no way around it. The other thing you should know is that the majority of the microbes is not on the surface on our planet. The majority of the microbes is sitting below our feet, both in continental subsurface and marine subsurface. The idea is rather old. It's from 1992. This Goldschmidt was a geochemist. They started speaking about the deep life or pockets of life in the crust that are fueled by geothermal energy. And in the last 30 years, we learned a lot about this. So much so that if we look at the latest inventory of carbon reservoir on our planet, the crown goes to terrestrial biomass, essentially because of land plants, the amount of carbon that is stored within lignin, cellulose, and those other compounds. But if you look on the side here, about 13 to 14% of total world biomass is actually in the deep subsurface. So it's in the deep soil, deep sediment, in the crust, continental crust, and in the marine crust. And if you look at the composition of the subsurface of the different biomass, you can see that while land plants and fungi dominate terrestrial biomass, bacteria and archaea, microbes dominate the deep one. So the majority of the microbes are in the soil, in the sediment, and in the subsurface. And this is showing you exactly the same in terms of number of microbes. This is underground, 10 to the 30 cells. This is in soils, this is in the ocean, and this is in animal guts. So if we think about, if we recognize that biogeochemistry on this planet is microbial and has been microbial throughout time, and the majority of the microbes is sitting below our feet, we do a quick math, and we cannot ignore what microbes are doing on slow time scale, and that's one of the key of what microbes do. And we also collected a significant amount of data on their abundance. This is a log 10 of cell counts per gram of sediment or square centimeters of rock. And we see that there's a significant amount of biomass, 3, 4, 5, in some places up to 7 kilometers in the crust. So we're talking about one of the largest ecosystems on our planet. The interesting things about this ecosystem is the microbes that are slow growers. And when I say slow, I don't mean they grow in a week or in a month. Some of these microbes is being calculated at turnover times of thousands of years. So they interact with geology at the scale at which geology happens. The other thing you should know and remember is that life really has evolved to occupy all available environmental niche. All of them. As far as we have liquid water, in one form or another, we find life on this planet. So much so that today, going to a place where there's liquid water and not finding life will be one of the greatest discoveries of our time. Also because proving the absence of life is very, very difficult. Some time ago, we started thinking about the distribution of niche available for life on this planet in terms of four very simple parameters: pressure, salinity, pH, temperature. And we started asking, what are the boundary conditions for life on this planet? What's the range of pH that is naturally found on Earth? What's the range of surface or near surface pressure where temperature is still conceiving for life? What's the temperature range at which we can still have liquid life? Note that we go to over 400 degrees because of hydrostatic pressure in the ocean and deep sea hydrothermal vent. And then we started collecting information about life's limit and trying to map the two on top of each other. So if these are the boundary conditions of life on our planet, this is what we know about life from cultures, investigation, and so on. And as you can see, if we forgive the highest temperature, we have life that has occupied almost all available niche on this planet. And it seems like it's been doing so rather quickly. All our proxies in the geologic record, all our proxies that are genetics, they suggest that the majority of the metabolism have evolved very, very early. And in the Archean eon, so there has been what you can call the Archean explosion of metabolism within the prokaryotes, the same way we had the Cambrian explosion of body shapes and type later on. And some of the records are rather remarkable. I don't know how many of you think about the limit of life. We go from -18 to 122 centigrade for temperature. We go from 0 to saturation in salinity. We go from slightly negative pH to 12.5. So really broad range of adaptation. And in doing this, life has occupied a diversity of different environments and works with the periodic table in ways we don't recognize yet. Now, if I show you the periodic table, everybody speaks usually about Schnapps element: carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, which are the main elements that are building block for life. If you take a periodic table and you ask the simple question of how many elements in the periodic table can be utilized, metabolized, or mobilized by life overall, the question is non-trivial, because there's not a single collection, and we're still discovering new elements with which life can interact. And how many of you thinks that life can interact with 10% of the periodic table, 50% of the periodic table, 70% of the periodic table? Let's try to raise. 10%, how many? 10%, no one? 50%? Well, there's few. These are the color life can interact with, and there's few missing. For example, recently we discovered enzymes that are lanthanum and cerium dependent. So I should add a few more colors in this periodic table. There are microbes that are capable not just of breathing oxygen or nitrate or sulfate. They can breathe arsenate. They can breathe tellurate. They can breed selenate. They can breed uranate, uranium. There's microbes that interact with compounds most of us don't even think about. So when you think about the complexity of the reaction that microbes are capable of doing, it's huge, and we have no gut and handle on it yet. This means also that microbes will interact with minerals, for example. These are 3 examples: calcite, amorphous calcite, pyrite framboids, or twisted stalks of iron hydroxide. All 3 of these are biologically precipitated, or there's a biological mediation in precipitating these forms of these minerals. And this is a list of the minerals that biology can either precipitate or dissolve. You can see here we have a problem for those of you that are more familiar with microbes, because all the experiments are done with microbes we can culture in the lab, and they're fast grower ones. And while on the other end, in the environment, we have a lot of uncultured microbes that are slow growers. So this is a biased view, probably a very narrow view compared to the type of mineral they can interact with. And finally, the last things you should know, and now we get into the bulk of what I wanted to show you, is that life and planet have co-evolved in many ways. I found this the most interesting because I had the luck while growing as a scientist to interact with geologists and biologists alike. And if you go to a geologist and you ask him to tell you what the history of life of Earth looks like, in brief, it's going to show you something like this. And you can find a figure like this in papers, on Google, on YouTube talks, and so on. It's going to tell you we had formation, core differentiation, moon forming impact, late bombardment, onset of the Wilson cycle, that's plate tectonic, Great Oxidation event, snowball Earth, modern Earth, and so on. So that's the history of our planet through the eye of an old school geologist, let's say. And then you can do the same with the old school biologist, and that's what you get. All the geologists as appear is formation of the Earth, and stops there. And then you have evidence of life, stromatolite, rising oxygen, first nuclei, multicellular life, land plants, animals, humans, and so on. And it's interesting how the 2 views don't overlap at all, with the exception of this, the Great Oxidation event, the onset, the rise of oxygen, of atmospheric oxygen, which is perhaps the biggest example we have of biological impact to a planetary scale that has completely changed everything. So I thought about starting with the most obvious case study in the evolution of life and planet, and I'm sure other colleagues will touch on it, which is the Great Oxidation event. I think you've seen this slide before. This is just the time history of our planet from the onset of biology, and then we have present level atmospheric concentration of oxygen. And you can see this, our planet has been reduced or anoxic for a very long time. Then we have a period between 3.25 to 3.45, the boundary is still debate, in which we have onset of accumulation of oxygen on our planet, due mainly to photosynthesis, but not only. We can speak about that a little bit. They probably started before, we're not sure when, but that's the Great Oxygenation event or oxidation event is when oxygen started to accumulate. Then we have a long period of hypoxic or low oxygen level throughout the planet, and then we get to modern day levels. And you can see our planet went from more reduced to more oxidized over time. Now, you've seen this equation before. Say yes if you do, or raise your hand. Have you seen it? You recognize it? Sure. Have you seen this one before? Yes or no? Yes? Now yes. It's obvious, right? We have photosynthesis and respiration. How many of you stopped for a second looking at those 2 equations, realizing that they're exactly the same equation in reverse? Exactly the same. For every mole of glucose we produce, we free a certain amount of oxygen. For every mole of glucose we breathe out the same amount of oxygen. So how comes we have 21% of oxygen in our atmosphere? If we breathe as much as we produce, those are 2 sides of the same medals. Why did we accumulate oxygen? To accumulate oxygen, you need to start to hide the candies, as one of my mentors used to say. You need to take away the good things to eat so you can start to accumulate this around. This is an example of geo-biocoevolution. Biology is producing the oxygen, but geology is hiding the reduced carbon, mainly through organic matter burial and subduction. It's taking away some of the fixed carbon so that oxygen can increase over time. And one of the unspoken things about the Anthropocene is that every time we burn fossil fuel, we're not just producing CO2, we're also consuming oxygen. So that's something you should keep in mind in the discourse. Now, in doing this, oxygen started to accumulate, and that's probably where the first great mass extinction happened. Think about you sitting on a planet that has been for close to 2 billion years completely anoxic. And suddenly, oxygen comes in. Your ocean starts to rust away. You start to precipitate all the iron. Those are banded iron formation, massive deposits of iron. And suddenly, you start to have oxygen radicals, phantom chemistry, oxidation, photooxidation, all sorts of crazy things are happening chemically and physically. And if you are a microbes that has been anaerobic for the longest time, suddenly you need to cope with it. And you either become extinct, you adapt to oxygen, or you run away, you hide in what we call today anaerobic extreme environments. So biology as cyanobacteria and oxygenic phototrophs, they completely changed the face of our planet, causing perhaps one of the biggest extinctions that we cannot study because microbes don't leave behind a lot of fossil. And for sure, they don't tell us what they were doing. So we lost a significant portion of the diversity, both taxonomic and metabolically, and we don't know anything about it. Possibly the first mass extinction of microbial life. We should always remember, I'm still talking about microbial life. But this, besides being an increase in oxygen, and besides being probably a big mass extinction for microbes, was also a big opportunity. Because if you look at the composition of the ocean and atmosphere before the Great Oxidation event and after, you can see the type of compounds that were abundant changed throughout time. Because of oxygen, we went from very reduced compound being abundant, mainly iron 2 and hydrogen sulfide, to getting nitrate, oxygen, and sulfate as most abundant oxidized compound laying around. Now, this gives an opportunity, because biology went from using very reduced redox couple to carry out its metabolism to using very oxidized electron acceptor throughout time. This is the electron tower we teach in microbiology to explain you how redox chemistry works. We use glucose with oxygen. There's a lot of energy to be gained there. Some microbes use hydrogen with nitrate. That's a lot of energy. But the electron tower shows also a time component, because all the reduced couples, they were very abundant early on, and you don't get the oxidized electron acceptor until you're later in the history of our planet. So to me, the redox tower becomes also a time axis in which things evolve throughout time. Oxygen changed a lot of other things. I'm borrowing this from Robert Hazen, Bob Hazen, a mineralogist. They realized that the abundance of mineral and the type of minerals changed on our planet because of oxygen. There are minerals that got produced because of the Great Oxidation events, and there are some minerals that got very rare or nearly extinct on the surface of our planet because of that. This is an example: pyrite, uranite, siderite. Siderite, very unstable with oxygen, was probably very abundant, is not anymore all over the place. Now, minerals are great, but life has a great interaction with minerals, because the majority of the redox reaction we carry out as life are actually controlled by metal centers that help to shuffle electrons around, that have deep roots in minerals. This is the center of the carbon monoxide dehydrogenase, an enzyme used by a large number of anaerobic microbes, including methanogens. They use this enzyme to get close to the production of methane that can influence the greenhouse gases. Well, the structure of this nickel-iron sulfur cluster is basically a stretched structure of the nickel substituted graphite. So there's a deep link between what metals were available, how they were available, and how life used that. So much so that the diversity is huge. Iron sulfur, manganese, molybdenum iron, copper sulfide. These are all metal centers used by biology to do biogeochemistry. Now, if we go back to the redox tower, we can see yet another way in which the increase in oxygen has influenced life, and life has influenced the planet, because this is, again, the redox tower we were talking about, very reduced compound, very oxidized. You can couple them top to bottom to get energy as biology does. And to do this, biology uses a diversity of metals, as I just said, that are finely tuned to the redox potential of the couple. For example, copper is a great metal to use if you want to breed oxygen or nitrate or very oxidized compound, while tungsten or nickel are a great compound if you want to breed and use very reduced redox couple. The interesting thing is that the availability of those metals through time has also changed as a result of the Great Oxidation events. For example, if you look at the abundance of these elements in the ocean as oxygen increased over time, we can see that iron went to a concentration of 10 to the 4 to a concentration of 10 to the 9 in most oceans, and is completely depleted free iron from surface ocean, while things like copper went from 10 to the minus 23 to 10 to the minus 8. So became suddenly more abundant. This means that some of the metal that life is using to breed oxidized couple that became available when oxygen increased, were not available before, became available because of life oxidizing the planet. It's like a chicken-egg scenario. To use oxygen, you need copper, but to mobilize copper, you need oxygen. So there's a lot of nuanced way in which those type of geo-bio interaction happen. And things become more complex if you want to dive into the biology, because if you look at this diagram here, well, molybdenum became more abundant, and iron became less abundant, so I can think of iron as being an early cofactor and molybdenum as being a late cofactor, and then we jump into an enzyme that is very, very important, which is nitrogenases, use them to fix N2 to ammonia, and there are 3 variants: molybdenum-containing, vanadium-containing, iron-containing nitrogenase, and I will bet all my money that the iron one is the old one and molybdenum came later. Then you do the phylogeny. No, the molybdenum one is the old one and the iron came later. What's going on? It's more complex than that. It becomes very difficult to disentangle how life and planet co-evolved. In spite of all that, we moved from something like this. This is a simplified diagram of biogeochemistry in the Archean. We have an oxygenic photosynthesis, we have sulfate reduction, we have sulfur reduction, methanogenesis, autotrophy, heterotrophy, to something like this. Oxygenic photosynthesis come online, brings the oxygen around from the water, and then suddenly you can move to this, and then you can move to this, and this is modern day biogeochemistry. So there has been a huge evolution in the way things changed from here to here throughout time. So that's an example of the most well-known one, which is the first one, evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis and the Great Oxidation event. Beyond saying that it brought oxygen to this planet, it also changed the mineral inventory, it changed the way organisms had to cope with oxidative stress, it changed the redox couple that were available, it changed the cofactors that were available to biology. It did a lot of dramatic change to our planet. Other example, mineral diversity, I just mentioned it. Redox metal cofactor, we barely mentioned it. The evolution of acidophile and a peracidic environment is another good example I'm not going to go into today, but think that the majority of hyperacidic environment today on our planet are product of biology. And about 30% of the copper we use as a society is actually coming from biological extraction. We didn't know about. It's biology mobilizing copper sulfide in our mining operation. The evolution of hydrogenotrophy, the evolution of land plants. There's a number of examples of coevolution we can and we should study, and we haven't gotten any details. The last point I want to make is that in looking at what the Anthropocene is doing today, and in looking in the many ways biology has already impacted in a destructive way the planetary trajectory over time, you need to think that the planet has a complex set of feedbacks. And it's very difficult to predict when you pull a string on one side what is going to react on the other side. But the effect of the coupled biological and geological activity are far-reaching and important. So much so that one of the first to recognize this was another geochemist, Vernadsky, was virtually unknown to the West for many years, but in 1926 published a book in Russian called the Biosphere. And I really suggest you buy it. It's a simple book, it's a short book, it's a great read for all of you. And Bernansky recognized that the life is a geological force that shapes the Earth. And he recognized that the emergence of life fundamentally transformed the geosphere. And he thought that the emergence of human and cognition will fundamentally transform the biosphere once again. He also thinks that both life and cognition as consciousness are actually essential feature of Earth's evolution. In other way, any planet that is going through a certain trajectory is going to evolve life and is going to eventually evolve complex life. This thinking was later accepted in the West and transformed into Gaia Theory in the 70s. I invite you also to go view Gaia Theory again, not with the eye of the popularization of the planet as being an organism that can defend himself, but as the original theory that says that our planet is a complex system of feedbacks that when you pull on one side, the entire system responds. The original Gaia Theory is about system approach to Earth science. It's not about having a superorganism that responds to things. And so much so that today, a lot of my colleagues, they work thinking about habitability, other planets, the distribution of life in the universe. They think that life is a prerequisite to have life on planets. What I mean is that the majority of cases, we have habitable condition, and we have our planetary condition. Sometimes they overlap, so you have an habitable zone where life can emerge. And many people now think that life is easy to get started on a planet, as easy as it is to synthesize, for example, amino acid. We can do it in hydrothermal condition, we can do it in dry, wet cycle, we can do it in asteroids. We found amino acid in comets, in the interstellar space. Building amino acid is not difficult. What is difficult is not even setting the onset and the emergence of life. What is difficult is for life to start to control planetary processes like climate, like temperature, like the complex feedback that life and planets have, to maintain the planet habitable and not go early to mass extinction, the sterilization of the planet. So many people think that we have not an emergence bottleneck. It's not difficult to create life, it's difficult to onset Gaia. So if you onset early regulation, the Gaia regulation, you can maintain the planet through a trajectory, and we know our planet has gone close to losing everything a few times. Think about snowball Earth, when the entire planet froze over completely a few times, or the ice ages. We got close to losing life probably, but we maintained it through complex feedback of biology and geology, the planet habitable. So we think that we don't have an emergence bottleneck. We have a bottleneck immediately on the onset of Gaia. So we have a lot of planets in the cosmos that are actually habitable and inhabited planet, but life goes extinct very quickly because it's difficult to create the complex set of feedback. So in thinking about the Anthropocene, we should start thinking about the feedback we have with the planet, with what we're doing, and how this can change the trajectory of the planet, and how previous large-scale impact of biology have actually changed the trajectory of our planet. And we went from being a planet like this, a ball of magma, to being our planet today, instead of losing the atmosphere like Mars, or going through a runaway greenhouse like Venus did. Because we know, for example, that Mars had water once, and we know they both are in the habitable zone. So what happened? What changed? If there was life on Mars, why got lost? Why got destroyed? So there is only one question remaining. What will the coevolutionary impact of the Anthropocene on the Earth system? To what extent will it affect human society? To what extent will it impact basic Earth function? Now I'm going to take 30 seconds to tell you that there's a great open access book you can download from the Cambridge University Press website, which is called Deep Carbon, that gives you a walkthrough surface and deep Earth carbon cycling from the geochemistry, geology, planetary, and biological perspective. And you find a lot of good introductory read. I really suggest you download it. And finally, I'm going to steal a second to highlight the competition. We just started a new master program in the biology of extreme environments in Naples. The lectures are online. We also are uploading them on YouTube. So if you are interested, go take a look. It's an interesting opportunity. And with this, I thank you very much. Thank you again, Andrea and everybody, and I'll get any question if there is. Any question, thought, comments?
Questions? We go here. Any questions, comments?
Even comments useful for me to know, getting some feedback on the things I'm speaking about. Did you already know all of them? Are they interesting? My interest usually is to get you to walk away with thought that you didn't have before about how life and planet co-evolved. Anything at all? I can see some people shaking their hands, but nobody speaks. Yes? So the question is, talking about extinction, if I think that the feedback toward the geosphere we're producing is going to be strong enough to generate extinction. That's the question. That's a great question for which I have not an answer. We know we are pushing into extinction a lot of species. And the rate of extinction of a lot of animal and plant species is accelerated because of human impact. And it goes beyond the introduction of CO2. It goes through fragmentation of habitats and a lot of things that a lot of colleagues here work and can speak better than I do. So we know we're pushing extinction. Are we pushing mass extinction? I don't know. That's a question for experts to answer. And what that impact will be on us, I have no idea. If you think about past extinction, there were a tragedy, losing all the dinosaurs, but it freed up an ecological niche for the mammals to develop. So what we are opening niche up for? Giant cockroach? Maybe, I don't know. That's going to be very difficult to predict. Any other question or comment?
Okay.
Thank you, Andrea, again.
No, thank you again.
I'll be around 2 days, so if anybody wants to talk, come here.
So we have coffee break, we have lunches, so you can interact with the speaker, with Donato and the other speakers. Don't be shy. So, thank you very much, Donato, again. And we can move to the second lecture of, what is there? The second lecture of the morning that is given by Professor Emilio Padoa-Schioppa. Many of you already know Emilio. He's an Associate Professor of Ecology at Hawaii University at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. And the topics and the title of his speech is The Epoch of Environmental Surprises. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrea. Well,
This is the pointer, if you want.
yes, of course. And maybe we can.
Faccio il PowerPoint.
Sì, grazie. Okay. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Donato, for this inspiring talk. My point of view about Anthropocene is a point of view of an ecologist. And I try to divide the presentation. Something is overlapping with Donato told, because exactly if we look to the history of the Earth, is an history of interacting systems. And this is really important also for us ecologists. And then I want to spend some words exactly about this epoch of the Anthropocene. And then I move more deep in ecology and in the concept of systems in ecology. Finally, I want to speak of the concept of environmental surprise with some examples. So, exactly, if we start thinking to the history of the Earth, maybe it's a little more complicated than the map that Donato showed us, but this idea of the history of the Earth in 10 steps came from a geologist Robert Hudson, that he wrote a very nice book. I strongly suggest all of you to read, has been translated in Italian, Short History of the Earth, and is really inspiring, I think, for a lot of people. We see some of those events Donato discussed very well. From Robert Hudson, there are 10 sticks really important, and just I want to raise your attention. Well, what is it? That the Great Oxidation is the number 7. So many of them happened in the beginning of the history, if we look to the long history of the Earth. And also, this map is taken from another book of Robert Hudson, and we have a long history of the Earth and the systems that interact each other. So this kind of this approach is, we can see in that way. We start with a lithosphere and the hydrosphere that are interacting, then an atmosphere, and then a chemosphere that become a biosphere, and inside of the biosphere appear, but it is at the end of the history, more or less, humans, and now we are in this system where human is a part of a force that shape the dynamic of the Earth system. And this is exactly what Vernadsky proposed. I didn't know personally Donato before, but in some of my slides in the past, in this there is also a picture of Vernadsky, exactly because I think he was definitely the first to propose this vision, and it is quite important also for ecologists, and normally we mention him in the history of ecology. So, now where we are. I think we need to come back 20 years ago when this man, Paul Crutzen, Nobel Prize for Chemistry, he won the Nobel Prize in 1997 because of a study of an ozone layer in the stratosphere. And 2 years later, he was in a congress in Mexico, and the topic of the congress was the human impact in the Holocene. And he raised the hand and say, okay, it's a pity. It's a pity that we are speaking about Holocene because we must recognize that we are in the Anthropocene. And exactly because he was a Nobel Prize, he told that this, let's say, with a very strong impact. And he realized that something else before used this word, and many others used this concept before. As our director mentioned in the talk, the first one was Stoppani, a geologist, more than 1 century ago. But so, Paul Crutzen was exactly a Nobel Prize. So you know that when a Nobel Prize speaks, it can have a bigger impact than many other people. And he told in the same time that something else find something similar. You see this, this book, Something New Under the Sun, is a book of an historian. And the point of view of this historian is that in the 20th century, man became a global force. So exactly the same concept of Crutzen from a totally different point of view. And now, a few years ago, the main scientific journal like Nature had a special issue to human epoch, to the Anthropocene. But this term moved from the scientific field to the society. You see The Economist, I think it was in 2 or 3 years ago, also show Welcome to the Anthropocene. So it's something that moves from science to Anthropocene, to the society. And the point, exactly, I suppose maybe later, yes, this is mainly work for geologists. But when we start to study this idea of Anthropocene, one of the questions is when it starts. Because we have an international chronostratigraphic chart with all the geological time divided in the nested system of geology. So eons, era, periods, epoch, and so on. And the question is, when we close the Holocene and we open the Anthropocene. And this is, as far as I know, is still an open question. I have, looking, as I told, I'm not a geologist, but as an ecologist, looking to this debate, is quite clear that if maybe 20 years ago some geologist was not convinced about the Anthropocene, now the majority of them is totally convinced, but they didn't agree on the beginning of this epoch. And there are more or less different options. This table is taken from a paper of Masi and Lewis, 2015, on Nature. They propose different options. And obviously, to choose the right one, we need to follow the rule of geology. I think that then later, Professor Malinverno will explain us better than what I can do. But we may recognize now we speak slowly about those hypotheses. An idea is that when humanity spread outside Africa and caused megafauna extinction, this can be a starting point for the Anthropocene. Then there are different options linked to the rise of agriculture. Then there is someone who speaks about new world, old world collision, so the invasion of Europeans in America, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or the Great Acceleration in the 20th century. Let us see. Okay, megafauna extinction had some impact on the biology, but also on the biomes of the Earth. Because when human activity caused outside Africa the extinction of big mammals, the cold steppe that was the most widespread biome in the Earth disappeared, and the forest started to grow. So the surface of the Earth changed. Against this hypothesis, there is the observation that is not synchronous in all over the world, because obviously the widespread of humanity was not synchronous everywhere, and so this is probably not the best candidate. The agriculture, and linked to the agriculture, the animal domestication changed a lot the world, the societies. So for many authors, this can be a good hypothesis to start the Anthropocene, because our modern societies came from agricultural societies. Once again, I think the main problem is that there is not a synchronous signal to start, to consider a good transition time. Something else say, no, we must go to the New World, Old World collision. So when Europeans invaded the Americas, and that event had a very big impact on the biological world, because we disseminate species around the world. We bring species from America, we send species in America, and so the biological world changed. And changed also the humanity. Millions of inhabitants in America were killed by Europeans. We started to bring slaves in America. So it was really a big change, and for the first time in the human history, the economy all around the world become connected. So we go outside the science, but if we look from a sociological point of view, this makes sense. Maslin and Lewis, they suggested that there is also a signal, because in the beginning the carbon dioxide decreased because of the growth of the forest in southern part of America, and they think this can be a good signal for that. But a lot of other people doesn't agree at all with this. Then Industrial Revolution. This is quite clear why. In the beginning, also Paul Crutzen suggested that can be the starting point as something else. With the Industrial Revolution, we started to burn and to produce energy, and to release carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But once again, this didn't happen everywhere in the same time. So the last option is to consider as a beginning of Anthropocene the middle of the 20th century, when human impact became bigger and bigger. And the picture you see about a nuclear explosion give the idea that humanity had a possibility to change drastically all the Earth. There are different indicators in socioeconomic trends, but also in Earth system trends that suggest that this can be a good option. And also, I think, from geological point of view, exactly some sign of nuclear explosion can be considered as golden spoke for this. So often when I show those options, then the question is, but what is your point of view? And I think it's not really important, because I'm not a geologist, and I wait that geology give us the final answer. The point is that we are discussing when happened, not if happened. And I think this is a big difference. For me, as ecologist, this last point, great acceleration in the 20th century, make really sense. But is, let's say, the end of a movie, and all the other events are linked one to the other. We have a great acceleration because we had Industrial Revolution. And we had Industrial Revolution because we had we invaded Americas. And we were able to invade Americas because we domesticated some, not exactly big, but let's say medium big mammals as Jared Diamond explained very well. So, and in Eurasia, we domesticated those mammals because we were quite lucky that we didn't destroy all the fauna like what happened in other parts of the world. So, of the mammal fauna. So all the events are linked. Then, and I think the other things that is quite new is we are discussing about the starting point of a new geological epoch, and discussing if is 1 century or the other century. I suppose this is something new also for geology that normally discuss about millions of years or something like that, but okay. Some idea about the impact we have on the Earth, I think is quite clear. This is taken from a paper of a group of Stockholm that show quite well that we overpass the boundary of Earth systems. And with the idea of boundary of Earth system, they say the boundary where humanity grow. This is another example that show, okay, in the past there are cycles considering temperature and the sea level. Sorry, this is in Italian, but I think. And they, now something is changed. And something more, again, this card, I think, is familiar to you. Once again, is the carbon dioxide that in the past 800,000 years. And we see that move up and down, but now we are here, and more interesting, we cannot say this is something linked to Homo sapiens, because Homo sapiens was not on the Earth. But then, something more about the biological impact of humanity, maybe answer to the question that was proposed before. This is a study of colleagues from Israel. They try to evaluate the biomass of birds, of all the birds, and they show that the majority of the biomass is domestic birds, so chicken, turkey, and so on. And just the 30% are wild birds. So it's quite difficult to say that we don't have an impact, a footprint on biodiversity. Something more impressive, if they did another study about the estimation of biomass for terrestrial mammals. And once again, the majority of the biomass are domestic mammals. So mainly pigs, cows, obviously also dogs and cats, but then human, and then wild mammals, wild terrestrial mammals are just the 4%. So this lead scientists who study biological history to say that we are in a new time of mass extinction. We recognize 5 mass extinctions in the past, and this is the 6th one. 5 mass extinction after Cambrian. So is correct, as Donato told before, we have a very big, with oxygenation, we had a very big mass extinction. But then, the point is that we lose, we have an estimate that say we lose between 10,000 and 50,000 species per year. Obviously, it's an estimation because we don't know exactly when a species is extinct. It's much more difficult to demonstrate that a species is really extinct than demonstrate that still exists. Because obviously the point is that when you see the species is quite clear. When you don't see a species, you don't know if you don't see because it's extinct or you are not really able to detect the species. And this is a, so we are discussing about estimates, but the estimates are impressive. Between 10,000 and 50,000 is an extinction rate much faster than the normal extinction rate that we have in normal times. And the causes are linked each other. So now we recognize that climate change is one of the drivers of extinction. Another one is habitat destruction, invasive species, human pressure, pollution, over-harvesting, and all of them are linked. So it's quite difficult when a species is disappearing to say, okay, it's disappearing only for climate change or only for over-harvesting. Often all these causes are linked and one with the other. This lead a geographer and ecologist, Earl Ellis, to propose a few years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, he proposed a very interesting map. The title of the paper was Putting People in the Map, and the map you see is a map of anthropogenic biomes. So say, normally when we speak about biomes, we think to steppe, to tropical rainforest, cold rainforest, and so on. They are based, those maps are based on climate and on potential vegetation. You say this is not a good way to describe the reality. The reality is that we have people, and he proposed, so he take in account the land use and the density of a human population. And this is a result, it's a totally different map, but I'm nearly convinced that in the next 20 years, we will find in the textbooks of ecology, we don't find only the biomes maps, but something like that. And I want to add something more, moving to ecological systems. This book was published 9 years ago, Law, Theories and Patterns in Ecology. Walter Dodds is an American limnologist, and he tried to summarize the laws in ecology. Is a quite long list of laws, 35 basic laws, 5 candidate laws. I want just to show you that in the basic laws, Dodds wrote, okay, the ecological systems obey to laws of physics, of chemistry, of mathematics, of course. They think we can understand ecological systems if we consider evolution and natural selection as Darwin first proposed and then changed during the 20th century, from Darwin to extended synthesis that now we have. But the third one is, okay, we must recognize that now Homo sapiens dominate everything. And I think it's a quite interesting perspective. So, giving a short look to the work of systems in ecology, I think one of the most inspiring books and papers came from Holling, from this idea of adaptive cycle of panarchies or panarchies, where he described ecological and also social and economic system in the same way. The idea is that they have a similar cycle, and so Gunderson and Holling in 2002 they published a book, Panarchy, that explain all this concept. And they analyze the property of a system like a potential capital, they means in ecology, biomass or energy, in economy, economic capital. the degree of the connectivity of a system and also the resilience of the system. So if we look into dimensions like this, in 3 dimension obviously is more difficult to understand, but it's something like this. So we can say also in that way, we try to simplify the 3 dimension like this. And they studied, but I don't want to speak, it's quite interesting if you read the book. This is the history of a society, an economic society. So it's a society of a telephone, and they explain that it works in that way. But this can be also applied to forests. And I try to give you a short example. This picture you see is a forest in the south of Italy, in Gariglione forest. Now is Sila National Park. I like a lot this example because I did my master thesis in this place, and so I suppose I know something about what I'm speaking. Gariglione forest was well known in the beginning of the 20th century to be considered a virgin forest, a forest never managed by man. And this is quite strange in Europe because it's not usual. So exactly my thesis, one of the goals of the thesis was to understand why this forest remain untouched for many centuries. Why the kingdom of Naples needs tree, needs wood for ships and so on. So why they didn't manage this forest like other forests in Calabria? And I try to reconstruct the history that start, well, in the beginning of the 18th century, an economist of Kingdom of Naples came in Gariglione forest, and he wrote a relation that is still available in the Archive of Naples. And he told, from this forest we can get a lot of tree. They are big tree, good tree for our needs, but the forest is too remote, and carrying out tree from the forest to the sea is too expensive. Obviously, we were in the beginning of 18th century, so this was is quite clear that it was expensive for them. So he suggested, don't do nothing, because it's not worth it to do. And I think the bureaucracy in the past was exactly like our bureaucracy. If something say don't do nothing, nobody do something for a long time. So nobody did nothing until the kingdom of Naples disappeared, and we had the Italian kingdom. But in the beginning, the new kingdom didn't care about forest, about this. They had other problems. So they started to think to manage this forest in the beginning of 19th century. Sorry, in the beginning of 20th century. Sorry. And that time, the idea is that an old growth forest that still continued to grow for 2 centuries from the so a very old growth forest must be cutted. Now foresters don't think in that way, but in the past they had this idea. If you cut the forest, new tree can grow and is much better. So the Italian government sold the permission to cut the tree and sold this permission to an Austrian society. But they sold this in 1914. So they were ready to cut when we had the First World War. And obviously, everyone that was Austrian in Italy was not allowed to do nothing. And this is the reason why in 20 years of the past century, the forest was still untouched. If you want to know the end of this history, what happened in 20 years, touring club tried to say, okay, but this area of Gariglione, they are more or less 4,000 hectares, so not a very big area. We can maintain to show how can be a forest without human activity. But they lose this battle. They struggle for Gariglione forest and for the Pineta of Ravenna, that for Italians has an historian significance, because it was the place where the wife of Garibaldi died and so on. So they won more or less in Ravenna, but they lose in Gariglione. And at the end of 20 years, in beginning of 30 years, they cut more than 80% of the forest biomass of the forest. If you go in Gariglione, well, I cannot say now. The last time I've been in Gariglione was 15 years ago, so I'm not so sure that is still correct. But if you go in Gariglione, probably you will see some tree of the past. They left some tree, and they are quite impressive tree, because it's a beech forest mainly, but a beech with 4-5 meters of circumference, so incredibly big, totally different from the tree that we are used to see. Then, in the 1954 was started a new management plan, thinking that we needed to have a parcel of forest with the same age, because the idea is we cut a tree regularly. Then a few years later was established a national park, so cutting tree was totally forbidden, and now something new started. So this is an Italian example of such kind of hauling cycle. Last point, yes. Last point I want to mention is the idea of environmental surprise. That I think is something that came from the idea of chaos theory in meteorology, but the man that better explained this approach was Bright in 2000 in the State of the World report. He wrote a chapter devoted to the idea of environmental surprise, and say it's something unexpected after different events, and we need to consider this exactly in this Anthropocene epoch. So the idea is that if we have a very short-term dynamics with few elements, we can build models that predict very well, but when the number of elements, the level of complexity increases, much more difficult. He say that there are three mechanisms that can explain environmental surprise: discontinuity, synergy, trends. And then say, okay, we have an environmental surprise when a synergy can produce a discontinuity, discontinuities can produce a synergies, positive feedback that produce discontinuity, cascading effects, and something like that. I'll give you some example. So discontinuity is something that changes suddenly in a trend or in something stable. And it is quite important that he explain, maybe in the beginning we don't detect, and then we start to detect. Synergy is something due to the interaction of different phenomena, and the final result is much more than the sum of each individual phenomenon. Feedbacks, obviously, normally we think to negative feedback. Predator-prey is a typical negative feedback. the prey decrease, so the predator decrease, so the prey started to increase, and so on. So this is a typical negative, but there are negative feedbacks. But there are also feedbacks where at each level the system increases the answer. And then trend, tendency that escapes to the observer perception, an invasion of alien species. This is a famous study of toadiness in Australia. They were imported because of to do something similar to biological control of disease, but those toads are venomous for a predator, and the predator in Australia didn't know that. So mainly are big reptiles, crocodile or snakes that eat toads, but when they eat, you see, this is what happens, they die. And the final result is that the number of mammals that are pests for agriculture increase a lot, because normally snakes and crocodiles eat those, but if they decrease because they eat also toads. And you see in Australia, they describe this like a disaster, because it's really a disaster for agriculture. It has a big cost and so on. So a trend is something like that. This is a well-known example of a weed-like aquatic plant that doubled the area occupied from one day to the next, and in a month covered the entire lake. So I want to show you not only this, but let us start. It's something like that. If you see in the left upper corner, it's quite difficult. We have a very small red square, and I want to show you what happens if we suppose that in 20 months, not in a month, in 20 months we cover all the lake, doubling. It's something like that. You don't detect nothing. Now maybe we start to see something. Okay, so exactly in the beginning, for more than half of the month, we didn't detect really the phenomenon. And some example of discontinuity that can produce synergism. An intense use of pesticide against potato midge make a discontinuity when a phenomenon of microevolution happened. This is quite typical, well known, but the result is a synergism that was forcing the abandonment of 1 million of hectares of agricultural land in South America. Or a synergism that can produce a discontinuity. We are in Eastern Canada, long-term drought. Long-term drought reduce the water supply to some lakes, and this means less organic debris and increased water transparency. Phenomenon 1. Phenomenon 2, absolutely not linked to the first one, but the ozone depletion, the stratospheric ozone depletion increase UV radiation on the lake, and this combined increase the quantity, the both phenomenon combined increase the power of penetrating of UV in the water, and this is the discontinuity, and so on. A positive feedback is the reduction of Arctic ice cap. Global warming causes Arctic ice cap to retract, but since oceans, water absorbs more light radiation, increase to warm, and so increase the the retreat of ice cap and so on. And this is an example of cascading effect with excessive fishing pressure close to Alaska coast lead other effects. And what we see that is that in the ecological network, every effect has another effect that has another effect and so on. And the final result is something definitely unexpected in the beginning. Something more, the spread of disease, this is a well-known disease, can be considered as an environmental surprise because it's linked to some change. And I want to say this is totally an history to write because also COVID-19 can be considered something similar to an environmental surprise. I want to show there is a discontinuity, the spillover probably as far as we know till now from bats to humanity. You know quite well that is not sure at 100%, but this is a possibility. Then another discontinuity, we have much more people than in the past, around 8 billion, and the humanity was very well connected and incredibly connected. So if we look, those maps are the spread of coronavirus starting in January 20, and we have to go in this direction, and here we are in the beginning of May 20. So in few months, every corner, and if you go in this website, you can see exactly in an animated graph. It's quite interesting because in few weeks we see that this new disease reach every corner of the world. In the past, other disease, they were much more slower, exactly because the humanity was less connected. Okay, I think I use all my time, more or less, and also I'm aware that I am the main obstacle from you and the coffee, so I thank you for the attention, and if you are interested, this is a part of a literature. This is literature in Italian, is more divulgative and a little more technical on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilio. Some questions, comments?
Well, maybe during the coffee.
Discussion and then we go to the coffee break.
I don't run from.
Okay, so we can close the first session of the morning workshop and have the break until 11. So we will start broadcasting again at 11. So switch in Italian, il coffee break. Se uscite da qua dovete avere il vostro tagliandino verde, giusto? Seguite le indicazioni, quindi si entra direttamente nel bar. Col tagliandino c'è un caffè, una pasta e qualcosa da bere. Va bene? E poi ci ritroviamo qua alle 11 che ripartiamo con la seconda parte della mattinata. Grazie mille. Ok, benvenuti, welcome back again. Thank you for being time. We can start with the second session of the morning. And so it's a pleasure to introduce to you Elisa Malinverno, Professor Malinverno. She's a professor of paleontology at the University of Milano Bicocca in the same department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. And the title of her speech is The Geological Basis of Anthropocene and Paleoclimates on the Earth.
Actually, I made a change.
Okay, very good. Elisa, cosa preferisci? Con il microfono vagante o questo? Sì, no, questo è il pointer, se vuoi. Ecco qua.
Okay, thank you. So I made a slight change to the title. So I will first focus on paleoclimates of the Earth, so looking at the geological record of climate change through time at different time scales. And then I will look at the Anthropocene from the geological point of view, so describing what the problems are in defining the Anthropocene as a time unit in the geological time scale. So I will start with this figure that shows that in the last century, or a century and a half, we have a large availability of climatic data from many different types of measurements that we can make. And especially with the advent of satellites, we have the availability of data at very high temporal resolution, but also at very high spatial resolution. And as we go back in time and we want to reconstruct climatic variations, we have a very limited data set, very few measurements of climatic parameters and at very specific locations. So this is true for the last centuries. As we go further back in time, we can rely on historical documents that tell us about times when climate was much colder, like in the paintings we have on the left, or times where climate was warm. For example, data about the cultivation of cereals at high latitudes, or the colonization by the Vikings in Greenland. Or we have archive data about crops or the blooming of vegetation, which allow to build a history of recent paleoclimatic variations. But if we want to go to really obtain a quantitative reconstruction of climatic change, we have to use proxies. Proxies are the tool for paleoclimatologists, and proxies are indirect measurements of climatic parameters that we can obtain by measuring biological, physical, and chemical parameters within an archive. So these parameters are stored in archives, which are basically the physical bodies that contain climatic information. In this figure, I'm showing the best archives that we can think about when we want to reconstruct paleoclimate. These are archives that allow reconstructions at high resolution. So two of them are of biological origin, like the tree rings or the corals. And the other two on top are archives that derive from the accumulation of particles, like snow in the case of ice caps, or sedimentary or biogenic particles in basins, which can be lakes or marine basins. In particular, when we talk about marine basins, we are thinking about anoxic basins, which allow the preservation of the annual layers. And other types of archives exist that we can use to measure proxies, paleoclimatic proxies. And some of these archives allow us to go back in time a lot, for not just centuries, but for a million years. And of course, as we go back in time, the resolution of the archives is typically decreasing, and also our capacity to date the archives decrease. So as we go back in time, we tend to consider climatic change on longer time scales with a lower resolution and with a higher dating uncertainty. As we go closer to our time, we have a larger availability of good archives with high resolution, and also which can be dated with high accuracy. So now, in this part of the presentation, I will describe climatic variations that we can reconstruct through proxies at different time scales. I will start from the older times and come slowly to the recent. So here is in a graph showing climatic variations in the last about 4 billion years of the Earth history. So we are looking at climatic change at a very long time scale. It's a very qualitative graph showing variations of temperature. It's in qualitative way, in relative values. And this graph shows that the Earth climate has changed between two states. One which is called the hot house or greenhouse, which definitely warm conditions with no ice present on land. And another phase called the ice house, where ice was present with different extensions on land. As we can see in the right part of the graph, CO2 variations are in phase with these climatic variations and are thought to be the main cause for climatic variations. And the main control on CO2 variations at this time scale is attributed to the varying amount of CO2 emitted from volcanic activity, which changes through time, and the modulation by weathering of rocks on land, which consume CO2 from which take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So the interaction and the interaction between these two processes and the varying magnitude of these two processes is thought to be responsible of the large CO2 shifts at this time scale and in the end of the large temperature variations at this time scale. We can see that sea level also changes in phase, with high sea level corresponding overall with the warmer climate and low sea level corresponding with a colder climate. And in this case, also in this case, the geological forcing is important because it regulates the size of the ocean basins, therefore causing the relative change in sea level. And also the continental plate movement is important because we need a continent in polar position in order to have ice on the poles, at least. So now I will shift to more recent times and consider the last about 60 million years, 70 million years of the Earth's climatic history, looking at this graph that is showing varying values of oxygen isotopes, which measured on carbonates, in marine carbonates. The fractionation of oxygen isotopes is considered as a proxy for both paleotemperature of the water and the volume of ice that is stored on the continent, because basically the light oxygen is stored in the ice and the heavy oxygen remains in the ocean basin. So we can read this graph of oxygen isotope variations as both a change in temperature and a change in the ice volume on land. So the presence of ice on the continents in the form of continental caps. So for the last 65 million years, we have a record from the hot house, a significant warming at the end of towards the end of the hot house, and then a cooling trend, which leads to a sudden, let's say sudden in geological time, decrease in temperature, which coincides with the development of a large ice cap on land, in particular on Antarctic. And that's where I put the arrow, and that's when we pass from a hot house into the ice house in which we are now. Ice is present on the continents, on land. The presence of ice on land is not just deduced by this graph, but is also supported by the presence of ice-rafted material, blocks of rocks transported by the ice into the ocean. And we have several records of that around Antarctica. And this point is set at about 34 million years. On the right, we have the corresponding values of CO2, atmospheric CO2, as reconstructed through several different proxies that I'm not going to comment. But we see that also at this time scale, CO2 can be considered as the forcing factor for this climatic cooling. So as CO2 decreases for geological forcing, also the temperatures decrease. And we have the beginning of a real glaciation on the Antarctic continent. Following this cooling event, there is the return to warmer conditions. Basically, in the interval called the Miocene, we have warm conditions, like in our latitudes, we have evidence of tropical climates. And after that, there is a cooling trend that leads to the glaciation that we are more familiar with. So I will make a further focus on this interval, the last 5 million years, 5.3 million years. Here we start the Pliocene. And here, again, for this portion of the record, we have a good proxy, which is again represented by oxygen isotopes measured on deep sea benthic foraminifera, which provide basically a record, again, of ice volume variation with little influence from temperature, because we are looking at deep organisms, less influenced by temperature. In every figure, I put an arrow pointing to warmer or colder conditions. So also in this case, we have the warm on the right and the cold on the left, I forgot to mention. Throughout this interval, so starting at 5.3 million years, we have the Pliocene in geological terms, and the Pliocene is characterized by small-scale oscillations that lead to a cooling, towards a cooling. And at a certain point, at 2.6 million years, we put an arrow, a limit, with another geological interval, which is the Pleistocene, which is the interval characterized by more intense climatic fluctuations and more intense changes from in the size of the ice caps on land. At 2.6 million years, we have the evidence of the beginning of glaciation also in the northern hemisphere. So while before we had just an ice cap, we are confident that an ice cap was present on Antarctica, we have evidence of a real large, the growth of an ice cap in the northern hemisphere starting at 2.6 million years. And again, the main evidence is from ice-rafted material around in the North Atlantic. Following this interval, climatic change continues with a cooling trend that leads to the most recent climatic oscillations, which are higher in amplitude and have a different cyclicity. So, if this record is analyzed through spectral analysis, it is possible to recognize a cyclicity, or well, different cyclicities in the record, and in particular, the frequencies are at this time scale. We have a cyclicity at 100,000 years, which is especially visible in the upper part of the record, and then we can recognize a cyclicity at 41 and at 23,000 years. This cyclicity in the record points to the forcing from orbital parameters, which consist in the ellipticity of the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, the tilt of the axis of the Earth, and the precession. All these factors together change with these time scales and were studied by Milankovic and are thought to be the main cause, the main forcing on climate at this time scale of the glacial-interglacial variation. In particular, these orbital parameters don't change the amount of energy that comes from the Sun to the Earth, but affect the distribution of heat from the Sun to the Earth in terms of latitude and in terms of seasonality. And therefore, the orbital forcing is thought to be the main cause of climatic variation at this time scale. I want to focus now on the most recent, so I'm scaling up to the most recent time, and look at the last 800,000 years of the climatic history. Again, on the left, I'm showing it's the same type of datum, and I forgot to mention that this is the standard reference for paleoclimate that we use to compare with all the other proxies in other archives. So it comes from deep sea sediments and oxygen isotopes measured on benthic forams. So at this time scale, in the last 800,000 years, we can observe extensive variations in the amount of ice that is present on ice cap, with glacial phases on the left, long glacial phases, interrupted by sudden warmings that lead to deglaciation, but with the presence of ice caps. Ice caps that don't vanish, but they just become smaller. And for this time interval, we can also add information from other archives, like Antarctic ice cores, provide us very important data that can be associated with this information. And the longest record that we have up to now from Antarctica is for the last 800,000 years. And so we can couple the information and see that variations in the extension of ice cap on the continent correspond to variations in atmospheric temperature, which can be reconstructed with looking at isotopes of oxygen and hydrogen isotopes in the ice. But we have also information about gases stored within gas bubbles in the ice. And so we can see the famous correlation between changes in temperature and changes in the greenhouse gases. And at this time scale, we see that there is a very good correlation between CO2, methane, nitrous oxygen with temperature. And although methane is basically controlled by the extension of wet areas on land, for CO2, the main control factor are the oceans that regulate the exchange with the atmosphere in many different ways. I mean, that would be too long to explain, but the oceans are the main control factor for CO2 concentration in the atmosphere at this time scale. So for the Pleistocene, we have several records from other proxies and other archives. I just want to mention some of them, the most significant ones, but there are really a lot. So I'm using these figures from a textbook by Ruddiman, and I always use the reference curve of oxygen isotope, which is the curve about ice volume changes. So ice volume changes correspond to changes sea surface temperatures that we can reconstruct through different ways. For example, I put here just some figures about floral and faunal variation of plankton with warm species and cold species that tell us about climatic variation. Or we can measure proxies on these shells, like elemental ratios. The same variations are also observed on land. We have, for example, the pollen record that we can look at within lake sequences that tell us about significant variations in the type of vegetation related to climatic change. For example, we have large shifts between a vegetation made by trees or vegetation made by herbs as we go from warm, humid climate to cold and dry climate. This is an approximation, but if we look at many different records, we find this evidence of shifts at this time scale related to a combination of factors. So warm and humid are typically associated, and cold and dry are typically the other option. The same is true if we look at the sedimentary record on land. For example, if we look at the Loess sequences, the most famous ones are the ones of the Chinese Loess Plateau. And here we see variations at the same time scale, well correlated with the changes in the ice volume, where we have shifts from the position of Loess related to wind transport, aridity, and cold conditions, opposed to the formation of soils that correspond to humid climates, where soil can develop and lower the atmospheric transports. So this is visible as changes in color in the sequence, but we have the same record if you look at sediments in the deep sea. We will have a very similar signal, of course not the soil, but changes in the sedimentation. And now the Pleistocene is characterized by this significant glacial-interglacial variability that gets more intense in terms of amplitude as we go towards the recent times. So the last 4 cycles at 100,000 years are the most intense. And then we look at the most recent times, so what we call the Holocene, the last 11.7 thousand years. In this part, so the Holocene is the geological epoch and is defined by a different climatic condition from the Pleistocene. So the Pleistocene is the epoch of climatic variation, glacial interglacial. The Holocene is the present interglacial, the last interglacial. So if we look at the record of Holocene climate, for example, in ice cores from Greenland, the Holocene is a warm interval with the little variations, which comes after the deglaciation phase. So down on the left, we would have the glacial conditions. And so climatic evidence pointed to the recognition of the Holocene as a geological epoch. Relatively stable, but not so much, as we will see. In fact, there is a nice compilation that, from which I made a selection in this paper, from this paper, where if we look at different archives using different proxies, we can identify climatic shifts also within the Holocene, of course, at a shorter time scale, at the time scale of 1,000 years or even shorter. So I will comment a little bit on these curves. So on the right, we have the record from ice cores in Greenland. And then as we go towards the left, we have the data about the advance and retreat of glaciers, using both morphological data and the data from glacial lakes. We have record about the changes in the tree limits in the northern hemisphere. So the limit between the forest and the steppe, which is related to climatic change. As the forest advances, we are looking at the warming phase. Then we have paleotemperature reconstructions from marine sediments. And in this, okay, I will point it. No, non so come si fa. Okay, I will not point it. The black and green arrows there point to the record of ice rafting, transport of material by the icebergs in the North Atlantic. These are tiny, tiny peaks because there is no significant transport. Non so quale schiacciare. Grazie, perfetto. Okay, so this curve here, there are small peaks in ice rafted material that can be detected through specific measurements that tell us about small expansion of the ice cap in the North Atlantic. And finally, so all of these are climatic signals related to changing temperatures. And then there is another record here on the left, the second on the left, from the left, which is a record about paleohumidity. And in particular, this is a coupled record from lakes in North Africa. In particular, one curve is from geomorphological evidence of the change in the status of the lake, in the height of the lake. The other one is the study of diatoms, which are planktonic organisms that live in the lake and reflect the salinity of the lake. So this change in salinity reflects how much water was in the lake and diluting the salt. And so the horizontal lines point to the recognition of intervals where climate was warmer and also more humid, and intervals where climate was colder and also drier. In particular, in the last part of the Holocene, we have a record of a definitely drier climate. So the Holocene is an interglacial, is not stable, and it changes on this short time period, short for us geologists. I mean, it's very long if we consider it from now. These changes, there is a whole line of research enlightening that these changes have had an important impact on the ancient societies. So we have archaeological data that converge in indicating that some cooling events could have a potential impact on the collapse of society. So this type of research is very interesting, even though we cannot prove that a society collapsed due to climate change, but we can match the evidence, just show that the collapse occurred at a certain point in time. And so, for example, the event, there is an important event of cooling at 4.2 thousand years that coincides, in fact, with an advance of glaciers and the cooling trend, which coincides with the collapse of several societies in different parts of the world. And then as we come closer, we have the collapse of the Terra Mare in Italy, and then we have warm intervals which correspond with the development of some cultures, like the Romans developed during the Roman warm, what is called the Roman warm period, followed by a cooling phase with the advance of glaciers again, which also coincides with the collapse of the classical Maya civilization, followed by what is called the medieval climate optimum, which is a warming phase. That's when the Vikings went and colonized Greenland, and this period is terminated by a cooling, which is called the Little Ice Age, which coincides with the collapse of the Viking Norwegian colonies in Greenland. So we can focus on this interval, which is very close to us, for which we have a lot of documentation, and for which we have also several reconstructions, several high-resolution proxies that allow the reconstruction. So here, all my graphs turn horizontal, and so time goes to the right. And so this is a curve from the last IPCC record that is a sum of the different high-resolution reconstructions and also some models of paleoclimate that show us these fluctuations in historical times, and also the warm and cold intervals. And I want to focus here on the Little Ice Age, which was this cold phase with the advance of glaciers also in our regions. And the Ice Age terminated around 1850, when climate was already moving towards warmer conditions. And here, human activity added something more, and so increased this natural warming. And so, what are we observing now? A lot of evidence about climate warming, like melting of glaciers. In this case, this is a mountain glacier, so it's somehow easier to monitor. Sea level rise and loss of coastal habitats, or this is an animation that we can obtain from satellite observations about changes in sea ice, which are shown against the average. The violet line is the average, and we can see that going on with time, we have a decrease, a shrinking of the sea ice. So all these are evidences of the recent warming, and we can put this evidence together with measures. So starting from the last century or a little bit more, we have real measurements that allow us to build curves of climatic change. This is again from the previous IPCC report that shows the changes in temperature, changes in sea level, changes in the volume of the mass balance of the glaciers, or changes in the snow cover. And all this, this is one of the things that make us think about the role of mankind in changing the Earth, changing the Earth climate somehow with the forcing. But of course, the Anthropocene is much more. It's not just about climate, it's about changes. So this is just a selection of the figures we've seen before. And the idea is that as human population grows, we have a larger and larger impact on the Earth. And this impact is visible from many different points of view. So I just made a selection here. We can think about increases in CO2, which doesn't mean just climate change, but also means a perturbation of the carbon cycle, a perturbation of the nitrogen cycle, change in land use, and all sort of impacts that mankind have on the Earth. So, as we think of the Anthropocene as a new epoch, we have to go into the geological time scale and consider what an epoch is and consider what the problems are when we want to make the Anthropocene a time unit. So I made a very short summary for non-geologists about the geological time scale and what it represents in terms of application, so the use that geologists make of the geological time scale. So the geological time scale is the framework in which we place the evidence of changes of the Earth, and so is the base through which we can understand changes and the history of the Earth. So the geological time scale has the aim of place the scattered pages of the Earth history in a proper chronological order, so put everything in order. And how does it make it? It works by selecting, identifying units, rock units, that represent time intervals. So in order to do that, the big work of building a geological time scale consists in selecting a good geological section or a good section, dating it, a section that can be dated with high accuracy, and identifying the changes that can be correlated globally. So the correlation is one important issue. So we need some signal that can be correlated. It can be a biological or a chemical signal that can be visible worldwide. And then in the geological time scale, we consider two types of units. One is the geochronologic unit, which means a time unit which is represented somewhere in a geological succession. And the other concept is the chronostratigraphic unit, which is the geological material that was deposited during that time. So the two concepts are basically the same thing, but they are represented by, they represent different concepts. One is time, and the other is the rock that represents this time. And so they have different names in the geological time scale. And all the decisions about making new intervals, new time units, and defining where the boundaries are made by International Commission on Stratigraphy. So in the geological time scale, the units, the time units, have names, and they have ranks. So I made just a big summary here to show the time units we are used to think about in geology. And what the problem is, and this shows what the problem is with the Anthropocene. So I put here the names for geochronologic and chronostratigraphic units. So the largest unit is the Aeon, or Aeon Thema, which has a duration of half up to 1 billion years. So of course, as we go farther back in time, the units are longer, and as we go closer, the units are shorter. Then we have the eras, and with the corresponding erathem, which have a duration of approximately 100 million years. Then we have the periods, or system, with a duration of 10 to 100 million years. I try to make an average, it's not easy. The epoch, or series, lasts about 10 million years, and the age, or stage, lasts about 1 to 10 million years. So here we see where the problem is. The Holocene is an epoch, and it lasts just 11,000 years, while typical geological epochs last 10 million years or even more. And then I just put a notation that years mean a duration, and A stays for annum and is a point in time. So just to indicate what we mean. In the geological time scale, there is a graphical standard. Standard colors are applied to each time unit. And this is the latest chronostratigraphic chart that was published this year. So it is the latest update about time units. And how is it represented? We have time increasing from top to bottom, and then starting back from the top of the next column. And it is interesting to note that the first three columns represent the latest Aeon, the Phanerozoic, the last 540 million years. While on the right, we have one column representing two Aeons, and so the oldest geological interval. So it's clear that as we go back in time, we have lower resolution, we can make, our subdivisions are much on a larger time scale. And And then also, these 3 columns represent 3 eras that have a significantly different duration. So the Paleozoic, for example, is almost 300 millions. The Mesozoic is about 180 millions, and the Cenozoic is just 65 millions. So it's a different duration of the eras, and of course, of all the time units at a smaller rank. Last definition is the concept of global boundary stratotype section and point, the so-called GSSP, which is the identification of standards of sections, geological sections, that can work as standards because they are well dated, they contain a well-visible signal which can be used to separate 2 time units. So the type section contains the boundary between 2 time units, and it is typically marked by the golden spike. The golden spike is a physical golden spike that is put in the rock section and serves to identify where the boundary is. Of course, the boundary must be also correlated through globally in other sections. So there are sections that are not the reference one, but which can be correlated. And so this is just a visualization of how the golden spikes are located along the time scale and the physical location of these golden spikes, mostly in Europe, but now they are spreading. And so geology started by using rocks, what we have in the geological record. So all the golden spikes, until recently, are in rock sections. But in the more recent times, other archives are being used as reference sections. And this is the example of the Holocene. The Holocene, the GSSP for the Holocene has been defined in an ice core. So this is an exception in the history of geological time. And so this is the figure of the publication that sets this boundary. But not only. Within the Holocene, there has, so 3 ages or stages have been defined, and also these are not defined in rocks or sediments, but they are defined, one in an ice core, a different one, the event at 8.2 thousand years, and the other one is defined in a speleothem, so a deposit, or well, a rock formed within a cave through precipitation of calcium carbonate. So this is defined, this was selected as the best archive where this event of 4.2 at 4.2 kiloyears could be identified. It is an aridification event, and it is important because it is thought to have had an influence on ancient civilizations. So now we come back to the Anthropocene. Which are the main questions in defining the Anthropocene as a geological epoch? So first of all, as it was said before, where do we put the limit? The limit was proposed to be placed at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So the year, the iconic year was 1784, the beginning, the birth of the invention of the steam engine, from which the Industrial Revolution started. But there is scientific consensus on placing this boundary in the mid-20th century, so in correspondence with the Great Oxidation, large changes induced by mankind. However, some authors state that the influence of mankind on the Earth was much earlier. So, for example, some state that the beginning of fire domestication can have an impact, deforestation can have an impact, and the beginning of agriculture is surely an impact, not only on land, but also on the marine environment. It's something that changes the budget of elements. However, if we go back and set it at the beginning of agriculture, we would start it in the Holocene. So, and also agriculture is time transgressive, so we cannot put a real date. So that's one point. The other point is that we need the Anthropocene, in order to become a time unit in the geological time scale, must be something that can be visible in the future and visible in terms of archive. We have to find a suitable archive to recognize it, to see it. Because, for example, if we go to the deep sea, I used to work with deep sea sediments, the Holocene sometimes is just 20 centimeters. So what about the Anthropocene? It would be like 1 millimeter. And so we might miss it in the record. So we need some archives that have good resolution and some evidence that points to the recognition of it. And so I'm just reviewing some of the possibilities that we can find in the literature. One possibility is a lithostratigraphic evidence, something that is visible in some sediments. And here, one idea is that if we look at the production of new minerals by humans, we can think that one of the most widespread mineral in brackets is plastic. And this is a graph showing the increase in plastic production through time, and the colors refer to different uses of plastic, so we don't care about that. But for sure, plastic has been produced in increasing amounts, and we find the record of it in the oceans, in the land. And so plastic could be, it would last longer and could be one stratigraphic evidence, something that we can recognize in the geological record. Another option is to look at geological materials produced by humans, like cement, concrete, and other deposits. Also, for this, we have the increase in production. The curve shows the increase in production through time. And this would also make a significant lithostratigraphic marker. However, it's mostly related to the continent, and so it's not, well, it is well correlated, but probably scattered in space. So it's not something that we can trace laterally in many different archives. And then we have another option, a biological signal. Of course, the Anthropocene also involves extinction of species, invasions of alien species, but it's difficult to identify them in a geological record. So some species don't even leave a fossil record, so we need something that leaves a record. So one hypothesis is to use broiled chicken. So broiled chicken is the species that has the largest population. We have a standing population of more than 23 billion of chicken altogether, I mean coexisting. And some of them will leave a record. And they are significant, their bones are different from the wild ancestors. And this is the curve showing the increase in production of them. So even though most of them are destroyed, dumped, they must leave a record. And as geologists, we can think of this record as a biostratigraphic marker. So we would call it an ACME event that could be preserved somewhere, maybe not in the oceans, but on land. And now we come to the most, I think, maybe convincing markers, which are related to the chemostratigraphic evidence. This graph shows a record from ice core of increasing CO2, something that we know, but also change in the carbon budget related to the release of CO2 from burning of fossil fuels. We know that fossil fuels come from organic material, so of biogenic origin, so they have a distinct geochemical signature. Ho quasi finito. It is basically carbon-12, the isotope carbon-12. And so as more CO2 is released from burning fossil fuel, we have a distinct signature in terms of carbon isotopes. There is a decrease, so there is an increase in carbon-12, and therefore we read it as a decrease in carbon-13, so the delta carbon-13 record. So this is a very nice figure. The two curves are really, really well, they really go along. And this is a record from ice core. So this is something that points also to the moment when we have most of the impact, so this interval here. So we need, the change must be visible in order to make a point in time. And this record can also be detected potentially in many other archives. So I don't have the figures here, but we can find it in tree rings, in corals, in lake sediments. So it's a potentially good indicator of the real impact of human activities. And this effect is known as the Swiss effect. It's something that is well known from the past. Then we can look at elements. Black carbon, for example, is the result of incomplete combustion. It is not necessarily anthropogenic because it can increase due to fires, natural fires, but it is also related to human activities. And along with the black carbon, we have also metals, heavy metals, that can be released both naturally but also from human activities. And this is the example of a measurement from ice core of sulfur, thallium, cadmium, and lead. And we see that each of these elements have a specific pattern which is related to the cause of release. For example, for lead, we have production of lead from burning of coal, but also from leaded gasoline. And in fact, the peak goes down as unleaded gasoline is used. So this is also a potentially good marker that can be detected in all the archives where the fallout is recorded. So in lakes, ice cores, potentially also in corals. And finally, we come to the probably the most clear evidence of human activities, which is related to the presence of radioisotopic tracers. Carbon-14, plutonium, and cesium are released to the atmosphere, into the atmosphere from nuclear tests or accidental releases. And even though the first use of a bomb happened in 1945, only in the subsequent years and with the more tests, more nuclear tests, the presence of these radioisotopic tracers is visible in the records. And here I'm showing two records. The one on the left is the measurement of these radioisotopic tracers in corals or in mollusks. And we see that peak values are actually reached in 1964. And on the right, we have cesium and plutonium measured in lakes. So potentially, we have several archives where this sign can be seen. It is very precise in time. So the tendency is to say exactly 1 year. So put the Anthropocene in 1 year. So the year would be 1974, not the real beginning of the tests. And so I think this is the conclusion. This is the message I wanted to give it. So I think that the definition of the Anthropocene as a new epoch is still to be approved. And personally, I think epoch is a lot. I would go for an age. But epoch means, defining it as an epoch means that changes are so large that we want to separate it really from the Holocene. And then possibly the radionuclides are the best way to track them because they will last in time, they will make a record that is which can be well correlated through worldwide and can be seen in different archives. So, point of view of geologists. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So thank you very much. Thank you. We have time for a short question, but short answer, preferably. Okay. Otherwise, we move and we will have the occasion to talk to Elisa during the break. Okay. So we can move to the next speaker and the next lecture, given by Stefano Malatesta. He's approaching the stage now. Okay. Come ti...
Grazie.
PowerPoint?
Vai col PowerPoint.
PowerPoint è meglio?
Sì, perché l'ho aggiornato lui. Ok, perfetto.
Okay. So we had three very intriguing and interesting lecture about with an historical perspective, with lessons that we can take from the past. And now I think that we are ready to move to more recent time and to see the impact of the Anthropocene. So it's a pleasure to have Stefano here. Stefano is a professor of human geography here at the University of Milano Bicocca. And the title of the lecture is Human Geography of Small Islands, the Challenges of the Anthropocene. Thank you very much, Stefano.
Grazie.
Cosa
Sì.
preferisci usare?
No, uso questo.
C'è il punk, se vuoi.
Sì, grazie.
Posso togliere la mascherina, immagino.
Grazie. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andrea, as organizer of this very inspiring workshop. Unfortunately, we are not in Lampedusa. And if you read the title of my presentation, you can understand, because I'm an expert in island studies, and I teach human geography of island studies at our master's degree in marine sciences. I must admit that I feel a little uncomfortable because I'm probably the only social scientist here today on the stage. I've been teaching human geography to natural and environmental students for 6 years. So I got trained, but please apologize if you don't find numbers or formula in my presentation today. My speech focuses on the social environmental dynamics shaping small islands' geographies by adopting a model that, in my opinion, may help to cross the multi-layered, multispectral paradigm that we call Anthropocene. The presentation won't take more than 30 minutes, so if you want, we can save time for Q&A. I'm following this structure, the structure that you find in this slide. Therefore, we start with dealing with vulnerability as a key feature defining social environmental interactions on small islands. Then I briefly introduce the human ecological approach. And finally, I present challenges small islands face with a specific glance on the Maldives. So let's start with the first point. Anthropocene is a key paradigm in what we defined nicology. Nicology, according to the definition provided by an Australian geographer, Grant McCall, is the study of islands in their own term. So trying to approach islands by an internal perspective, avoiding universal and taken for granted categories like isolation, remoteness, uniqueness, and vulnerability. Island Studies Journal, which is the most eminent reference in terms of scientific debate on islands, recently opened a specific issue, specific sector on the Anthropocene, so Anthropocene and islands. And in this slide, you can find the reasons why, a very brief summary of the reasons why Anthropocene is so important nowadays in the debate on island studies. This year, so very recently, Chandra and Pooch, the editors of this volume called Anthropocene Islands, they wrote a paper critically reflecting on the use of vulnerability as one of the conditions justifying the overuse of Anthropocene in the study of islands. So they critically reflect, they pose this research question: should we reconsider the use that as experts, as scholars, as policymakers, the use that we do of vulnerability in studying islands? And this is exactly the first point I'm addressing today.
I'm sorry for the low definition of the table you find here in the left side of this slide, but I did not manage to find the original page. I'm sorry, but I just describe it briefly. This table proposes a ranking of the countries according to the IUCN forecast, counting the largest number of endangered species. The top of the list includes countries with a large portion of archipelagic or island regions. Ecuador, of course, Galapagos, the US, the former colonial empires of UK and France, Malaysia and Indonesia. Vulnerability is a key topic in the definition of small islands. A part of the scientific and political discourse on these places, generating, according to several authors, a taken for granted and automatic association between insularity and vulnerability. Islands are the forefront of climate change, are the forefront of environmental crisis, are vulnerable natural sanctuaries, are non-self-sufficient resilient systems. These are labels and refrains we constantly face as experts in island studies, in geography and environmental sciences. And these are labels that we find in the public discourse, in popular culture, but even in media and in science. As you know, climate change as a global process is the major source of small island vulnerability. The recent speech of the President of Barbados, COP26, is the last political act of a long history dating back to the foundation of the Alliance of Small Island States. A body, an institutional body, representing these countries to the major international conferences with a main goal: boosting small islands' advocacy in the fight against climate change effects. If you take a look to the graph on the right side of this slide, you find a table showing how climate change has been acting as the only constant issue in the recent debate on small islands' environmental crisis. For this reason, we use the expression predominance of climate change. My purpose today is approaching the Anthropocene in the study of islands, trying to answer to this question: are islands merely objects of Anthropocene, as the popular discourse and the scientific discourse tend to present, or they may be even subjects of the Anthropocene? And so the challenge I propose today is moving from a global to a hyper-local perspective. By adopting a synthetic but illustrative definition, vulnerability measures the level of exposure of a system facing hazard or changes, for instance, a potential flood event. This definition is operative, may be operative, only if we focus on social environmental interactions determining the level of exposure and shaping the system. If you study vulnerability by a place-based approach, avoiding universalism and global perspectives, and if we bear in mind that vulnerability is risk and context specific, we can't say small islands in the south of the Mediterranean are vulnerable to drought. We should consider that small islands in the south of the Mediterranean have a significant level of exposure to drinkable water scarcity during the peak of the touristic season, because the peak happens in July, in the middle of the Mediterranean dry season, and tourists are highly consumptive subjects. This is considering vulnerability as a risk and context specific operator, category, anything. Okay, we tend to use vulnerability as a global and universal feature. Place-based approach and social environmental interactions are the basis of what we call the human ecological perspective, aiming at studying the response human systems activate in case of social environmental crisis, mainly coming from anthropogenic causes. Here you find the diagram of the human ecological model and a brief explanation of its theoretical background. So the social response to change is a study that this approach focuses on the body of practices, adjustments, knowledge, and technologies that community develop and adopt to cope with environmental change. The aim of this approach is to discern interactions between social practices, value, and change, shaping social environmental systems at the local scale. Before analytically describing this approach, let me share with you a story. Because science is often a change of biographical tales. And please don't consider this story as discouraging as PhD candidates, and you're gonna understand why I'm doing this recommendation. In 1934, an early career American geographer, Gilbert White, was nominated to serve in a committee that, after several name changes, became the Water Research Committee, a key body of the President Roosevelt New Deal. Gilbert White's PhD thesis investigated a basic research question. Why people living close to a potential flood hazard area did not accept compensation to move far from their homes. His thesis was the base of President Roosevelt's policies on water management, a little ambitious as a perspective. And above all, the theory inspiring the human ecological approach were presented by a paper written by Robert Cates in 1971. The human ecological approach is based on three assumptions. There is a constant interrelation among humans and the environment. Humans elaborate a set of adjustments to buffer environmental harmful processes. This set of adjustments is technological, practical, cultural, behavioral, social, and so on. Moreover, there is no separation among humans and environmental systems. In this perspective, and I'm reading literally a quotation coming from Robert Cates' work. This is the reason why you find the word men here. Now, currently we don't use men because of gender bias. We prefer to use humans. But this is a paper dating back 40, 50 years ago. In this perspective, with this focus on man as the ecological dominant, the interaction between man and nature tend over the short run to be stable, homeostatic and self-regulating, and over the long run to be dynamic, adaptive, and evolutionary in the direction of increasing control over nature's resources and buffering from nature's hazards. I'm briefly describing the main components of this model. The center is the change driver, the crisis, the event, the hazard. On the left side, we have the social environmental interaction organized in human use system. A human use system is a minimal but sufficient description of human use of a relatively small homogeneous area. And to set this description, we need to know information about human occupancy, demography, activities, input and output, productions, and so on. And then we have the environmental use system, the environmental processes, we should say today, that govern the generation of hazard-causing events, seismology, hydrology, biology, geomorphology, and so on. When a change occurs, the set of adjustment may be able to manage the change or must be reconverted or reset. Small islands share a set of social and environmental changes we can interpret by adopting this perspective, so the human ecological model, within the paradigm of Anthropocene. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in 2009 listed the most relevant effects caused by climate change to small islands' geographies across the Pacific Ocean, by forecasting dramatic scenarios in terms of drinkable water management and coral reefs bleaching. If we enlarge the scale, we can complete this list with 8 social environmental challenges partially related to climate change: the over-dependence from tourism, the marginalization of small islands, the loss of political agency at national and international level, waste management, energy production, water management, loss of traditional activities like, for instance, small-scale fishing, and the competition for resources. It's pretty interesting to notice that these challenges resound in the 2020 Isole Sostenibili report published by CNR e Legambiente, analyzing 27 of the 67 permanent populated Italian small islands, and that the PNRR pointed out energy management and small islands marginalization within its main actions and priorities. These challenges are all gathered in this image: the harbor of Ponza, Ponziano archipelago, during the peak of the touristic season, beginning of August, let's say. You can say the supply vessel providing oil, because the island is not sufficient in terms of energy. The ferry getting tourists to the only accessible gateway for car drivers, the harbor of Ponza. Fisheries fleet, second householder sales, and very important cultural heritage, which is the ancient cave that Romans used as Muren Hill to feed Muren Hills. Briefly, as a synthetic, glance of this picture, competitions for resources. In the last part of the presentation, I try to exemplify this approach by working on one of the key challenges the Maldivian small islands cope with in the era of Anthropocene: drinkable water management. As I mentioned, we use the expression predominance of climate change mainly referring to the debate within island studies on the predominant role climate change has been acting in public and in politically defining small islands as vulnerable places. We can read the environmental policies of the Maldives by adopting this perspective. Furthermore, we should link the predominance of climate change to the process of nation building during the last presidencies and to the legitimization of Maldives within the international chessboard as a symbol of climate change effects, and to the developing policies currently transforming the local system in the archipelago. For instance, the massive works of land reclamation ongoing in the country as a response, as an infrastructural response to climate change. As you can see, the Maldives are a symbol of the automatic association between small islands and climate change vulnerability, as stated by the IPCC years ago, one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. In this part, we mainly refer to the second national communication the government submitted to the UNFCCC in 2006, which is the real overview of the state of the environment in the country. And you find the reference here. Additionally, we need geography, of course. Here I visually represented what we can call as a tribal geography shaping the country, the archipelago. The permanent and non-permanent human system should be understood by separating the Greater Malay region, which de facto is the only urban settlement existing across the archipelago, spread over 5 islands, gathering capitals, the 36–38% of the overall archipelago population, resources, and political power, is the real core of the country. Then we have less than 190 inhabited islands spread over the whole archipelago, with a medium demographic average between 500 and 1,000 residents. And thirdly, according to 2019 data before the COVID, 145 research islands entirely devoted to luxury tourism, leased by private companies and subjected from the end of the 70s, so 40 years ago, to rigid quality standards in terms of environmental management, which, for instance, in terms of water management, force properties to install desalination, so to dissolve water. Surely climate change affects water management and drinkable water availability on small islands, as brilliantly synthesized by Ilan Kelman and reminded by the Ministry of the Environment. Furthermore, the coral archipelagos of the Indian Oceans, due to regional processes like the monsoon regime, and to geophysical characteristics like the high level of porosity of soils and the constant interaction among freshwater lenses and seawater, thanks to the presence of transitional zones, as you can see in the figure, are extremely complex places in terms of drinkable water management, generally speaking. These dynamics determine a potential high vulnerability for human systems supported by groundwater collection, such many settlements in the Maldives are. However, there is no univocal answer to the question you can find here. Or to be more precise, we need to understand all the dynamics involved in water management before stating that the islands are vulnerable to drinkable water crisis. We should integrate the preliminary background by a geographical reading based on 5 dynamics. The first one means dealing with the understanding of the differences among the core area, the so-called Greater Malay region, and the outer islands. Across the urban area, as you can see, drinking water demand is supported mainly by bottled waters, with a remarkable contribution given by desalination. The demand is constantly growing, increasing the pressure on the system, and above all, during the peak of dry season, blackout happens because the contemporary overuse of air conditioner and water pumps. Furthermore, space is the main constraint, so you can't implement further. On the other islands, here represented by Fatmagudda, where our university has its outpost, as you probably know, the majority of demand is supported by domestic and public rainwater harvesting systems, like the one you find in this drone. In case of water crisis, physical distance is the main constraint, because you have to bring water from the capital to the islands crossing the middle of the Indian Ocean. The second point refers to consumption models. This table shows the correlation among sources and uses on local islands. As you can see, rainwater covers the drinkable water demand, and other sources are used to support both domestic and public services. It's interesting to compare these data you find in this table to the ones reported by luxury hotels during the peak of the dry season. A luxury hotel with more or less 200 guests and 200 staff members gets more or less 200 liters of drinkable water consumption per day per person. On small islands, water management must be linked to human ecologies therefore to the complex set of practices, adjustments, strategies, and technologies that humans activate to cope with environmental challenges. For instance, water management is biounivocally connected to agriculture and food security. Here you find the strategy promoted by the Ministry of the Environment to manage water resources and foster productive technologies such as hydroponic greenhouses, for instance. Hydroponic production is a method facilitating the automatic association and correlation among water consumption and food production. These examples clearly show the necessity to consider small islands as integrated systems. Currently, the environmental governance is based on these pillars. Both for waste management and energy production, small outer islands are considered as integrated, partially self-sufficient systems, trying to minimize the dependency from outside in terms of input and output management. Supported even through the new release of an act decentralizing environmental governance. The integrated water resource management, here represented combining different sources and technology, is the application of this vision to water issues, to water management issues in general. Finally, referring to Johnson, Townsend, and Penny Roswell's work on flood events, we can identify a specific event as the catalyst of change. And I'm talking about the 2004 tsunami, which radically changed the water management system on local islands, moving from a massive use of groundwater to a dependence from rainwater and bottled water. State and international interventions during the first month of 2005, January 2005, few days after tsunami event, had as priority safeness of water and the implementation of a water supply mechanism on C2. The tsunami, of course, left even longer and long-time legacies at regional scale. Such a complex process may be organized and studied by using the human ecological perspective. Here you have the pre-tsunami water management system on local islands, populated, as I was mentioning before, 501,000 inhabitants, permanent population, locally working as fishers with a percentage of the land devoted to local agriculture, freshwater lands, and of course the high concentration of rainwater during the transitions between the two monsoons. The pre-tsunami set of adjustment was based on social, and I'm talking about shared meanings, distinctions among good and bad water, cooperative management of wells, self-sufficient water procurement at local level, and seasonal consumption patterns. As the tsunami occurred 26th of December 2004, and I'm intentionally using a non-direct anthropogenic event because I want to focus the importance of considering, in any case, the complex set of social environmental changes generated by any kind of crisis. As the tsunami occurred, groundwater got polluted, and the system have been forced to change the set of adjustments they need to provide drinkable water, of course. Therefore, introduction of industrial drinkable water, overuse of plastic, new businesses, just to mention that Coca-Cola is the main water provider in the Maldives since 2005. New consumption patterns, changes in agricultural techniques like the introduction of hydroponic, and the social identification of groundwater as dirty and bad water. And I'm getting to the end of this presentation. To conclude, inspired by massive work conducted by Barnett and Campbell on the Pacific Ocean region, we can summarize few lessons coming from the Indian Ocean. The first one is the importance of adopting a place-based approach in general to environmental challenges, even by adopting a universal and global paradigm as the Anthropocene is. Second is thinking small islands as integrated systems, as forefront of the globalization, as subject and not merely object of the climate change. Third is working in terms of water governance, in terms of environmental governance in general. And third, thinking about vulnerability not as a condition coming from insularity, but as a result of a complex set of exogenous and endogenous forces constantly interacting. So we started this presentation by tackling the vulnerability as a taken for granted feature and categories we use to define islands. And I guess that in the paradigm that we call the Anthropocene, you have to constantly bear in mind that islands are not just vulnerable to something coming from the outside, but they must be considered as one of the most important actors in a positive and, of course, negative way of human impact on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Very clear and interesting. Thank you. So you have to answer to some questions, if there are on the audience. No. Sorry.
Are there any questions from the audience? We will go ahead talking about the island in the first lecture in the afternoon by Paola. I have one question, or maybe two. The first one, is there any definition of small island in terms of size?
Yes, there are multiple definitions considering size, for instance, demography or physical size. I would avoid these definitions. I would prefer considering a mix of approaches. For instance, a small island is a place where in any point of the place you can appreciate the influence of sea on everything, so on climate, on bioecological systems, on social environmental interactions. But I guess that the most functional definition is defining small islands as ecotones. So places where you have to constantly consider interactions among marine and terrestrial ecosystem, human, natural, anything, to understand the ways the system works. So small islands as terrestrial and marine ecotones is a good definition. It's a transdisciplinary definition. It's the one I prefer.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And the second one, in terms of vulnerability, is there any general feature of the island that most affect the vulnerability? I mean, maybe the distance from the mainland, or the latitude, or any kind of general feature affecting this?
I guess that we must consider we must adopt at least a regional perspective. For instance, across the Mediterranean, many islands are located in regions that European Union classified as high vulnerable in terms of the effects to climate change, the south of the Mediterranean. But of course, if you consider the way humans manage social environmental interactions, this level of vulnerability may change significantly. I just give you an example. In Italy, we have 19 islands with no connection in terms of electricity network with the mainland. Some of them are quite close to the mainland, like Isole Tremiti, for instance, 12 miles. Some other are quite remote, like Ustica or Ventotene. The difference is in this case, the difference is not the distance, but the use of the islands by humans, because during summertime, there are good connections, there are big flows in terms of tourists and population, so they are quite accessible. During winter time, same distance, same island, same physical conditions, they are super far, because of course they are mono economies in a certain term, depending on tourism. So in my opinion, the first point to consider, the first feature to consider is the way we use islands. We build relationship between mainlands and islands. And the Mediterranean, Italian small islands are quite illustrative in this term. Just another example, again on Tremiti, if you consider that getting to San Nicola, it's quite easy because there is a ferry, and then if you want to get to San Domino, you have to take another boat. It's an easy way to understand that it's always about core periphery. You know, the peripheric islands, being a periphery doesn't depend from distance, but from management in general, you know.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah? Wait for a while. Come to you.
So, do you think it's in any way possible to give back this hyper-local perspective we talked about in global policymaking events such as COP26?
I guess that there is thank you for the question. There is an ongoing process, and that is the process that we experienced the last week by the performance of the president of Barbados, or Tuvalu. So using hyper-local cases as label, as examples, bad or good practices, and it works. It worked in the past. If you remember, just to give you an example coming from the country that we know as university better, the Maldives, in 2009, the former president of the Maldives, Mohamed Nasheed, performed a meeting of the government by a diving, and it was, of course, a spectacular performance. And he worked, because it acted, this performance acted during the COP in Copenhagen 2009. So this is a process already that we can already observe. And another perspective, more scientifically oriented, in my opinion, would be to compare different cases. So adopting a local perspective as a base, so for your field work, for your scientific approach to social environmental interactions, and then try to compare different cases in different, of course, in similar regions, to find commonalities and to find common guidelines. And this is something that is happening, for instance, across the Asian Pacific area, because there are many books, many edited books, many collections comparing different islands in this huge space, which is the Asian Pacific Ocean, as currently we define the older Pacific Ocean, you know.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting talk. I think, linking it to the question just got from back there, I think the most important issue here is the increase of sea level rise. Islands themselves have got the particularity of very limited space, and in 10-20 years, it's not going to be an issue of how you actually manage the resources, but it's going to be rather an issue whether you have space to manage the resources. I don't know if you've seen in YouTube this interesting video, the address by a minister of Tuvalu, if I remember well, that addressed the COP26 was half covered in water.
Yeah, the president of Tuvalu. Yeah, the one I mentioned.
This is what's going to be in the Pacific Ocean in particular. It's going to be the loss of space.
Yeah.
Not about resources anymore.
Yeah, I agree partially with you, and I say partially. Thank you for your question, because nowadays, if we analyze the ongoing policies in the Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean, so the most affected small island states facing sea level rising as a risk, we mainly have two visions. The first one is investing on infrastructural measures, like land reclamation. It's the easiest answer. Enlarging the islands. And in the Maldives, for instance, there are 195, 200 ongoing land reclamation processes in less than 200 islands. So, and I'm talking about dams, ports, enlargement of the islands. And this is the infrastructural response. It works. Materially speaking, it works. But the problem, and this is the second vision, is that reclaimed areas are intertidal zones, are transitional zones. And so by enlarging the islands, you are killing seagrass meadows, you are killing reefs, you are killing... And so the other vision will be acting on the protection of the reef, for instance. And integrating these two perspectives, as far as I know, in the case of as the Maldives, it's never easy because the infrastructural measure is more effective, is more impressive, and so now they are investing massively on infrastructural responses.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really impressed by your speech, and I'm sure you will agree with me that it's not only a problem of resources, and I realize that it's very often a problem of awareness and culture. Do you think we can do more about that?
Yes, I thank you for your question. I guess that I would answer with a positive message and a negative one, extremely negative. The positive message is that the Alliance of Small Island States and other bodies like the Alliance of Small Island States really, really have been acting as actors in the international debate. So without these bodies... No, because they represent just states or jurisdictions of states. But they during the last, I would say, 15 years, they have been able to put small islands at the forefront. And this is surely a good message and a good result and a positive result. 2014, we had the International Year on Small Islands. They represent less than 100% of the, no, less than, sorry, 0.1% of CO2 emissions globally, and they are the most vulnerable ones. So this is totally unacceptable, of course. The second message, which is purely negative, and I'm talking as a social scientist, from our point of view as European, and this is quite common in the US even, islands are colonies. The legacy of colony is still here. There are places when you go to enjoy your time, there are places for tourists, there are places to grab resources. Just to give you an example, the French overseas territories. Why the government in France, they don't want, they are doing anything to avoid the independence of New Caledonia, because New Caledonia is the third producer of nickel, as you know. So the colonial empires are still here, and islands are illustrative examples of this. This is a negative message, I know, but yeah.
Just allow me an intervention. I mean, we usually point the finger to colonial powers, but let's have a look at our own neighborhood. Let's have a look at the relationship of mainlands, and I'm talking about Europe. I'm not talking about colonial powers. Let's talk about the relationship of Europe, Italy, for example, and its islands, of Greece, where I come from, and its islands, and you will see clearly that islands, irrespectively of whether they're part of a larger country, or a colony, or an independent state, they have no real voice. This is the real issue. So beyond colonialism, I disagree with the colonialism approach. It's about size, it's about political power. They don't have any.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Italy is probably the only, and France is the only two countries who have provided autonomous regions for Sardinia, for Sicily, for Corsica, France is talking about, but this is not the
Yeah, they are resources. There is another interesting case, which is Croatia, because of the exceptionalism of close islands there. But you rightly pointed out the most important elements, which is the political relationship between mainlands and islands, surely. I totally agree with you. I just mentioned colonialism as a general process, but it's the part of the same discourse, surely. Marginalization, as I was saying.
So, thank you very much again, Stefano, and thank you also for this long discussion. So we are at the end of this morning session. So we have the lunch break now. And I remind the people connected to use in the afternoon at 2 o'clock, when we will start again with the afternoon session, to use the specific link for the afternoon. Ok, thank you very much. Quindi il pranzo è offerto alla mensa, qua dell'U12 trovate indicazioni e persone che vi indicano la strada. Per coloro che sono entrati e non hanno ancora il ticket, vi diamo il ticket, il buono pasto, se qualcuno è entrato senza registrarsi. Ci vediamo in mensa, ci vediamo poi alle 2, ricominciamo. Grazie mille.